"Can I borrow $5? Annie spoke. She looked up at Richard Whitmore with eyes so honest they almost seemed to plead. Richard looked her over from head to toe, the thin coat frayed at the cuffs, the old shoes worn at the toes, the small hand clutching a crumpled $10 bill, as if it were the only thing standing between her and something terrifying. $5? He asked. Annie nodded quickly. It was only a small nod, but it seemed to wound her pride more than any refusal could have. "Yes, sir," she said. "Just $5, please." The 24-hour pharmacy was almost empty at that hour. The aisles sat still beneath harsh white lights, the kind of lighting that made every tired face look even more exposed. Behind the checkout counter, the pharmacist held a small white medicine bag in his hand. He glanced at Annie, then at Richard, his expression uncomfortable but not surprised. "The medicine is $15, he said. "She only has 10. Annie turned back to the counter and pushed the $10 bill forward, as if presenting it one more time might somehow change the number on the screen. "It was $10 last week," she said. Her voice was strained, but she was still trying to keep it steady. "I bought the same one last week. Right here. I thought this would be enough." "The price changed," the pharmacist said quietly. His voice was not cold, but it carried the helpless weariness of a man who had repeated the same sentence too many times to people who did not have enough money. Richard picked up the bottle of aspirin he had placed beside the card reader. He had not paid yet. His gaze remained on Annie, cautious and distant. "So you ran here to buy medicine," he said, "but you only brought exactly $10? Annie swallowed. "That's all I have." Richard's eyebrow lifted slightly. "You didn't think to bring extra money just in case?" Annie's face tightened. "There is no extra." The answer was short, but it left the air between them quiet for a moment. Richard looked at the medicine bag in the pharmacist's hand, then at the $10 bill on the counter. "And now you're standing here borrowing money from a stranger." Annie's cheeks reddened with shame. She lowered her head for a second, then forced herself to look him in the eye again. "My mother needs it," she said. "Her asthma got worse tonight. Her old inhaler is empty. I ran here because this pharmacy stays open all night. I really thought $10 would be enough, because that was what it cost before." Richard did not answer right away. He turned the aspirin bottle in his hand, though his eyes were not on the label. "If it's such an emergency," he asked, "why didn't anyone come with you?" "There isn't anyone else." The words were simple, but some simple sentences carry the weight of an entire lonely life. Richard looked at the thin coat on her shoulders, then at the lonely $10 bill on the counter. "A person who doesn't even have $5 to buy medicine," he said evenly. "How can she guarantee she'll pay me back tomorrow morning?" Annie's face burned. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. I work in the morning," she stammered. "I clear tables at a diner on Ashland before the breakfast rush. I get paid after my shift. I can come back here, or I can meet you anywhere you want. I swear I'll pay you back." Richard watched her. "Do you do this often?" Annie blinked. "Do what, sir?" "Come into pharmacies in the middle of the night, come up short, and ask someone else to cover the difference." His voice was not loud, but each word landed clearly. "Is this how it usually works?" The pharmacist looked down, suddenly busy with the label on the medicine bag. Annie's shoulders drew in slightly, but she did not cry. She only took a slow breath, as if she had to remind herself to stay standing. "No, sir," she said. "I don't usually ask anyone for anything. That's what everyone says." "I know." Her voice trembled, then steadied again. "I know how it sounds. I know you don't know me. I know I look like someone who walked in here unprepared and now wants your money. But my mother is at home struggling to breathe. And I'm standing here with $10 for medicine that is now 15. I don't have a better explanation than that." Richard looked at her for a long time. Most liars grew quiet when stared down. Annie did not. She stood there, pale with humiliation under the pharmacy lights, still trying to keep her back straight because someone at home was waiting for her to bring that medicine bag back. The pharmacist cleared his throat. "She was here last week," he said. "She paid in full. Same prescription." Richard glanced at him. The pharmacist added, "I can't release the medicine without full payment. Store policy." Annie quickly turned back to Richard. "Sir, you can write down my name if you want. Annie Johnson. I'll give you the address of the diner." I'll give you my apartment number. I only need $5 until tomorrow morning." Richard still did not soften. He had met too many people who knew how to swear by family, illness, misfortune, and another person's compassion, only to disappear the moment they got what they wanted. $5 meant nothing to him. But the money was never the real issue. What he hated was the feeling of being used. And Richard Whitmore hated being fooled more than he hated losing money. "People promise a lot when they need money," he said. "Then once they get what they want, they disappear." Annie's lips parted. "I won't disappear. How would I know that?" She did not have a ready answer good enough. She looked at the $10 bill, then at the medicine bag waiting behind the pharmacist's hand. "Because I'm telling you the truth." Richard let out a short breath without humor. Words are easy. That struck her harder than his first suspicion. Annie lifted a hand to the edge of her coat, her fingers gripping the thin fabric as if she needed something to hold on to. "I'm not trying to steal from you," she said very softly. "I didn't say you were stealing. You said I would disappear." Richard looked at her. For a moment, the pharmacy seemed to grow colder. Annie swallowed and blinked several times, but she did not let the tears fall. Richard set the aspirin down. "I don't even know you. What if I lend you the money and you don't pay me back?" Then, Annie stopped. Her throat tightened with shame as she tried to defend her honor over an amount of money this man might never even remember. "Then you can come to the diner. I already told you where I work." "What if that isn't true?" "It is true. Do you have a phone?" Annie hesitated. "Yes, sir." "Then call a relative, a cousin, an aunt, a neighbor. Ask them to send you $5. Standing here begging a stranger probably takes longer than making a phone call." Annie's expression fell. Richard saw it, though he did not understand it at first. She lowered her eyes to the prescription she held close to her chest, then slowly shook her head. "There's no one to call. Everyone has someone to call." "No, sir," Annie said. This time her voice was much smaller. "Not everyone does." The pharmacist stood still. He was wise enough not to interrupt. Richard continued watching her with caution. "You want me to believe that your mother is sick, that you came here alone with $10, and that in this entire city, there isn't a single person who can help you with 5 more? Annie nodded slowly. She looked at the small white medicine bag still waiting behind the counter, then back at Richard. Every bit of strength left in her seemed to gather into one final effort. "If you don't believe me," she said, her voice low and tense, "you can look at this." She held the prescription with both hands and offered it to him. Her fingers trembled at the edges of the paper. "It has my mother's name on it, Linda Johnson. That's my mother. It says what she needs. It also says the clinic sent in the refill." Annie drew in a breath, trying not to let her voice break with fear. But the fear had soaked into every word. "Please, sir. I know you don't owe me anything. I know $5 is still your money. But my mother is waiting for this medicine, and I've already been gone too long." Richard looked at the paper but did not take it yet. Annie held the prescription a little closer. The gesture was almost a plea, though her voice still held on to the last of its politeness. "I'm not asking you to believe my whole life story. I'm only asking you to believe this paper. Believe the man behind the counter. Believe that I need to get this medicine out of here before my mother gets worse." The pharmacist placed the small box of medicine on the counter and spoke before Richard could answer. "Mr. Whitmore, her mother really does need this medicine." His voice remained professional, but it had softened. "This is an emergency inhaler, refilled through a clinic prescription. I saw a similar prescription last week. She isn't making this up." Annie gave the pharmacist a brief, grateful glance, then looked back at Richard. "I'll give you any information you need to find me tomorrow," she said. "My full name, where I work, where I live. I don't have much money, but I keep my word. Please. I only need $5 right now." Finally, Richard took the prescription. His eyes moved across the printed lines. Patient name, dosage, physician, refill instructions. Linda Johnson, emergency inhaler, clinic refill. Nothing about it looked staged. Nothing in Annie's eyes looked like an act. He looked back at the $10 bill on the counter. $5. Less than the coffee his assistant usually bought him in the morning. Less than the parking fee in one of the buildings he owned. Yet tonight, those $5 stood between this young woman and the medicine that could help her mother keep breathing. Richard opened his wallet, Annie's eyes fell instinctively to the leather wallet, then immediately turned away, as if even watching him take out the money made her feel a little more humiliated. Richard pulled out a $5 bill and placed it on the counter. "That covers it." Annie stared at the bill for half a second, then lifted her eyes. "Thank you, sir. I'll pay you back tomorrow. I promise." "You already said that." "I mean it. I hope you do." The pharmacist took the money, completed the sale, and placed the inhaler into the white bag with the receipt. Annie took the bag carefully, not roughly, even though every part of her wanted to run out of there immediately. "Thank you," she said to the pharmacist. He nodded. "Get it to your mother." Annie turned to Richard. For one moment, she seemed to search for something bigger than thank you. Something that could restore a little of the dignity she had just been forced to lay down under the bright pharmacy lights. But no words came in time, so she only bowed her head once, small and sincere. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," she said. "I won't forget this." Then she pressed the medicine bag to her chest and hurried toward the front door. The automatic door closed behind Annie, and Richard Whitmore remained standing at the checkout counter with the unpaid bottle of aspirin in his hand. He looked through the glass front door. Annie hurried across the nearly empty parking lot, both hands pressing the small medicine bag beneath her thin coat, as if one careless movement might let the darkness reach out and snatch away the only thing keeping her mother alive. The pharmacist cleared his throat. "Sir, your aspirin." Richard turned back. He took out his card, paid, and slipped the bottle into his coat pocket without asking for a bag. The pharmacist hesitated for a moment. Then he said quietly, "She was telling the truth." Richard looked at him. "I'm not supposed to get involved in customers' personal matters," the pharmacist continued. "But she's been here before. Same prescription. Last time, she paid in full. Didn't ask for a discount. Didn't make a scene. Didn't make anyone uncomfortable." The guarded look remained on Richard's face. "You know her well?" "Not well. But well enough to know she isn't the kind of girl who makes up stories in a pharmacy at midnight." The pharmacist picked up the empty basket Annie had left near the counter and set it aside. "Her mother has been sick for a long time. They live in the building on Mason Street. That place isn't easy to live in when you have breathing problems." Richard's eyes moved back toward the front door. Annie had already turned the corner. The pharmacist handed him the receipt. $5 is nothing until someone doesn't have it." Richard said nothing. He slipped the receipt into his pocket and stepped outside. His driver immediately got out of the black sedan parked by the curb. "Home, Mr. Whitmore?" Richard's hand had already reached for the door handle, but then it stopped. At the end of the street, he caught a brief glimpse of Annie's thin coat as she hurried past a closed laundromat. "Stay with the car," Richard said. The driver paused. "Sir? I'll be back." Richard did not wait for another question. He turned and started walking down the sidewalk. He kept enough distance so Annie would not notice him. The street was quiet, but not completely empty. A bus hissed at the corner before pulling away, leaving behind a thin trail of exhaust and the smell of cold metal. A few storefront lights still glowed dimly, reflecting off the damp pavement. Annie walked fast. One hand held the medicine bag tightly beneath her coat, while the other pulled her collar up against the wind. Her shoulders sagged slightly, not only from the cold, but from urgency, from fear, from having run too long through a night in which she had no right to slow down. Richard followed her, still not fully understanding what was pushing him forward. His suspicion was still there, but the pharmacist's words would not leave his mind. She paid in full, last time. Her mother really was sick. The building on Mason Street. Maybe Annie had told the truth. And if she had, Richard had spoken to her as if she were trying to cheat him out of $5. The thought made him uncomfortable. Annie turned onto Mason Street, where the buildings stood closer together, and the sidewalk was cracked, patched over with old slabs of cement. A row of low brick apartments stretched along the street, with metal fire escapes clinging to the outside walls like rusted bones. Some windows were tightly covered with curtains, others had towels stuffed along the frames to keep out the draft. Annie climbed the stairs to the second floor. Richard stopped near the entrance, half hidden beneath the shadow of the stairwell. He watched her reach the last door in the hall. She fumbled with her keys, dropped them once, then bent down to pick them up. Her fingers were shaking so badly that it took her 2 tries to fit the key into the lock. "Come on," she whispered. Her voice was soft enough not to wake the neighbors, but loud enough for Richard to hear. The lock clicked open. Annie pushed the door open before she had even pulled the key all the way out. "Mom," she called, her voice tight with urgency. "I got it. I'm here." Richard told himself he should stop there. He had only wanted to know whether she had really gone home. That was all. But the door did not close completely, and from where he stood, a sound drifted out that made him take a few steps up without thinking. It was breathing, not ordinary tired breathing. It was a thin, wheezing, broken sound, as if each breath was not being taken in, but dragged through a doorway too narrow inside the chest. Richard stepped onto the second-floor hallway and stopped a few feet from Annie's door. Inside was a small room, cramped and damp with cold. An old bed stood against the wall. A small table sat beneath the window. On it were several medicine bottles, a weak lamp, and a stack of bills arranged so neatly it hurt to look at them. A woman lay curled on the bed, one hand pressed to her chest, the other gripping a thin blanket. Her face was pale and exhausted, and each breath seemed harder than the one before. Annie dropped to her knees beside the bed and tore open the medicine bag. Her movements were quick, but not careless. She had done this before. That realization weighed on Richard more heavily than the sight in front of him. An 18-year-old girl should not be so practiced at fear. "Lift your head just a little, Mom," Annie said. "Just a little. I have the new inhaler." Linda Johnson tried to answer, but only a hoarse, broken sound came out. "Don't talk," Annie said quickly. "Please, Mom, don't talk. Just breathe when I tell you." She shook the inhaler, attached it to the spacer on the bedside table, and carefully helped her mother sit up a little higher. The blanket slipped down, and Annie caught it with her elbow while one hand stayed behind Linda's shoulder. There was almost no room left for Annie herself in that tiny room, but she still found a way to make her mother more comfortable. "That's it," Annie whispered. "Look at me, Mom. I'm right here. Breathe in slowly. One more time. Please, Mom. Just one more time." Linda tried to follow as best she could. The first breath was shallow. The second was a little better. The third still trembled, but it went deeper. Annie counted softly under her breath, her eyes fixed on her mother's face, as if she were reading every small change in her skin, her lips, and the sound of her breathing. Richard stood outside the door and suddenly remembered the aspirin in his coat pocket. He had walked into the pharmacy because of a headache. Annie had walked in because her mother could not breathe. If Annie's love for her mother touched your heart, please like this video. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional and inspiring stories. Several minutes passed before Linda's chest began to settle. Not completely. Not enough to call it peace, but enough for Annie to lower her head and press her forehead against her mother's thin hand. "You scared me so much," Annie whispered, so quietly Richard almost did not hear it. Linda's weak fingers brushed through her daughter's hair. "You got it?" "Yes," Annie swallowed hard. "I got it. You shouldn't have gone alone. I didn't have another choice." Linda turned her head slightly. At that moment, her eyes caught Richard standing outside the door. Annie followed her mother's gaze and froze. For 1 second, her whole body seemed to shrink inward. Then she immediately stood, still holding the inhaler in her hand. The shame that had just begun to settle appeared on her face again, this time even more painful, because the man had seen everything. The room, the old bed, her mother's breathing, and the truth she had been forced to beg him to believe. "Mr. Whitmore?" Richard did not step any farther inside. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to frighten you." Annie looked at him, then at her mother, then at the door that was still open. "You followed me? I wanted to make sure you got home safely." Even Richard could hear how unconvincing the answer sounded. Annie's expression changed. The hurt appeared before she could hide it. "You thought I was lying." Richard did not answer quickly enough. Annie gave one small nod, as if she understood. "I told you I would pay you back." Linda tried to push herself higher on the bed. "Annie," she said weakly. "Who is this man?" Annie turned back at once, concern overwhelming her embarrassment. "Mom, don't sit up. He's the man from the pharmacy. He lent me $5 for the medicine." Linda closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, there was exhaustion in them and a deep kind of shame. "I'm sorry," Linda said to Richard, her voice hoarse. She shouldn't have had to ask you like that. Annie pressed her lips together. Mom, please. No, Linda said, then coughed softly. Annie immediately stepped closer, but Linda lifted a hand to stop her. We'll pay you back. Richard looked at the two of them. Annie stood beside the bed in her thin, worn coat. Linda was still trying to steady each breath. The open medicine box lay on the blanket. The receipt had fallen to the floor. $5 had brought him all the way here, but now it no longer felt like money. It felt like an accusation. There's no need to talk about that right now, he said. Annie looked at him with an expression that was both cautious and wounded. There is, sir. It matters to us. I understand. For the first time, Richard let his eyes move carefully around the room. He saw the old heater near the wall, the window frame sealed with tape, the stack of bills arranged too neatly on the small table. Someone had tried to keep order in a place where life kept taking things away. Near the bed, a small lamp cast a weak glow. Beside it was a framed photograph, turned slightly inward. Richard's gaze stopped on the frame for half a second. Annie noticed immediately. She shifted slightly, not rudely, but clearly, as if protecting the last bit of privacy she and her mother had left. I should go, Richard said. Annie nodded, still tense. Thank you for the $5. Richard turned toward the hallway, but stopped at the doorway. Linda's breathing was still not completely even, though it was better. Annie had already sat down beside her mother again, one hand close to the inhaler, ready in case the tightness returned. She leaned very low, whispering something to her mother, while she herself was still trembling from the cold, from exhaustion, and from the fear she had just survived. Richard stepped outside, but he did not leave the building right away. At the end of the hallway, he looked back one more time. Annie was still bent over her mother. She pulled the blanket higher over Linda, then silently picked up the receipt from the floor, smoothed it flat, and placed it on the table as if even a small piece of paper could not be allowed to go missing in a life this poor. Richard stood there, his hand resting on the freezing railing, and for the first time that night, his suspicion began to feel very small compared to his shame. Richard stayed at the far end of the walkway longer than he should have. He told himself he was only making sure Annie's mother did not need an ambulance. He told himself the pharmacist's warning about Mason Street and breathing problems had made him cautious. But those were clean explanations, and none of them felt fully true. Inside the apartment, Annie's voice remained low and steady. Try one more breath, Mama. Not too fast. Good. That's better. Linda coughed, then pulled in air with less strain than before. Richard heard the old bed shift, heard Annie moving around the room, heard a glass being filled at the sink. He should have left then. Instead, he turned back. The door was still open a few inches. Richard raised his hand and knocked lightly against the frame. Annie looked up at once. Her whole body tightened, but she did not step away from her mother. Mr. Whitmore, I don't want to intrude, Richard said. I only wanted to ask if she needs a doctor. Annie glanced at Linda. She says no. Linda gave a weak, embarrassed smile from the bed. I've had worse nights. Annie turned to her quickly. Mama. Linda closed her eyes for a second, then opened them again. All right. I've had nights I should have gotten help and didn't. Richard heard the difference. It was not stubbornness. It was the voice of someone who had learned to measure every decision by its cost. He looked toward Annie. Has she been seen recently? At the clinic, Annie said. Last week. The clinic told her to go to the emergency room if it got this bad again, Linda admitted, then looked away as if the sentence itself had shamed her. Annie's face changed. You didn't tell me that. I didn't want you scared. I was already scared. Linda reached for her hand. Annie gave it to her, but her eyes stayed wet with anger she would not release. Richard remained by the door, feeling out of place in a way he was not used to. Men opened doors for him. Assistants cleared rooms for him. In this apartment, even stepping over the threshold felt like a decision that needed permission. May I come in? He asked. Annie hesitated, then moved a stack of folded laundry from a chair near the table. You can sit there. I won't stay long. She nodded, not quite trusting him, not rude enough to say so. Richard stepped inside. The apartment was smaller than it had looked from the walkway. A narrow bed, a table, 2 chairs, a hot plate near the sink, and a heater that clicked without giving much warmth. The walls had been wiped clean where hands could reach, but damp marks remained near the window. Someone had tried to make the place decent with very little. Annie noticed his eyes moving around and seemed to shrink under it. "We're cleaning tomorrow," she said quickly. "I was at work late." Richard looked at her. "I wasn't judging the room." Her expression said she did not fully believe him. Linda breathed in through her nose, slower now. "Annie keeps things better than I deserve. Mama don't." "She does," Linda said to Richard. "Works mornings, helps me, still finds a way to make sure I eat before she does." Annie turned toward the small counter and picked up the pharmacy receipt, folding it once, then again. "You don't have to tell him all that." Richard watched her fingers smooth the receipt's edge. $5. She was still thinking about it. "I can call someone," he said. "A doctor. Someone who can come here tonight." Annie shook her head. "No, sir. We can't pay for that." "I did not ask if you could pay." Linda's eyes opened wider. "Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate what you already did. Truly. But we don't accept things we can't repay." "That seems to run in your family," Richard said. Annie looked down. "My father taught me that." Richard's gaze shifted to the table. There were papers stacked beside a lamp. Bills. Clinic forms. An old Bible with tape along the spine. Behind them sat a framed photograph. The frame had been rubbed thin at the edges, but the picture inside had been kept carefully. Richard looked once, then looked again. The man in the photograph wore a dark driver's uniform. He stood beside a younger Richard Whitmore in front of a black town car. The younger Richard had one hand on the open car door, impatient even then, already becoming the kind of man who expected the world to move on his schedule. The driver stood straight, calm, with a face Richard knew before his mind was ready to say the name. Richard rose from the chair. Annie followed his gaze and stiffened. "That's private." Richard barely heard her. He stepped closer to the table but stopped before touching the frame. His voice came out lower than he expected. "Where did you get this photograph?" Annie stood between him and the table now, protective despite how tired she was. "It's my father." Richard looked at her. "Your father?" "Yes." "What was his name?" Annie's eyes narrowed slightly. "Samuel Johnson." The name moved through Richard like a door opening in a wall he had stopped looking at years ago. Linda turned her head on the pillow. "You knew Sam?" Richard did not answer at first. He looked back at the photo, at the driver's uniform, at the face he had not seen in almost 2 decades except in memory. "Samuel Johnson drove for me," he said. Annie's hand tightened around the receipt. "No, my father was a driver, but he never talked about rich people much." Linda's voice softened. "He talked about one. Not often. Only when Annie asked about the picture." Richard finally reached for the frame. Slowly, giving Annie time to stop him. She did not. He lifted it with both hands. The glass was clean. Someone had wiped it recently. "I gave him this copy," Richard said. "After a company dinner. He said his wife liked photographs, and I told him to take it. I had forgotten that." Linda gave a tired laugh that broke into a small cough. Annie moved at once, but Linda waved her off. "He brought it home like it was something important," said, "One day Annie will ask what her daddy did, and you tell her I drove for a man who needed looking after more than he knew." Richard closed his eyes for a moment. Annie watched him carefully. "How did you know him?" Richard set the frame down with more care than he had shown anything that night. "He was not just my driver." Linda's face changed. She knew what was coming, or at least part of it. Richard looked at Annie. "Your father saved my life." Annie did not move. The words seemed too large for the small apartment. "What?" she whispered. Richard drew a slow breath. "Years ago, there was a break-in at my house. It was not a simple robbery. I was careless. I walked into the wrong hallway at the wrong time. Samuel saw what was happening before I did. He pulled me back, took the hit meant for me." Linda's eyes filled, but she stayed quiet. Annie looked from Richard to the photograph. "He never told me that." "He would not have," Linda said. "Your father didn't like making himself the hero of a story." Richard's jaw tightened. "He should have. I owed him more than I gave." Linda turned her face toward him. "He said you tried. I did try." Richard's voice sharpened, not at her, but at himself. Then I let other people try for me. That is not the same thing. Annie stood very still. The receipt was crumpling in her hand now. After he got sick, we moved. We couldn't keep the old place. Mama said some letters might have gone there, but we never got them. Richard looked at the bills on the table, the heater, the damp window, the inhaler box on the bed. His mind put the pieces together before his heart accepted them. Samuel Johnson had once stood between Richard Whitmore and death. Years later, Samuel's daughter had stood in a pharmacy, humiliated over $5. Richard had looked at her and wondered whether she would cheat him. The shame came harder this time because it had a name attached to it. Annie, he said. She looked up, guarded again. I am sorry. She seemed confused by that. For the $5? For what I thought when you asked. Annie looked away first. You didn't know me. No, Richard said. But I knew enough to be kinder than I was. Linda's breathing caught again. Annie moved to her side, all else forgotten. She lifted the inhaler and checked the time on the pharmacy label. Richard watched her support her mother's shoulders with practiced care. Whatever truth had just been uncovered, Annie still had the same immediate task. Help her mother breathe through another hour. He took out his phone. Annie noticed. What are you doing? Calling my physician? Linda tried to protest. Mr. Whitmore? No. Richard's voice did not rise. But it ended the argument. Not this time. Annie stared at him. We can't afford a private doctor. Richard looked at the photograph of Samuel, then back at her. This is not about what you can afford. Annie's face tightened. She was too proud to accept help easily, too frightened to refuse it completely. Richard understood that now. He softened his tone. Let me make the call. After that, you can still decide what happens next. Annie looked at her mother. Linda's eyes had closed again. Her breathing better, but still thin. After a long moment, Annie nodded. Richard stepped closer to the window and made the call. His voice was quiet, precise, controlled in the way it became when he meant every word. This is Richard Whitmore. I need a doctor at the Mason Street units. Now, the call ended, but Richard kept the phone in his hand for a moment, as if the weight of it could steady him. On the other side of the small apartment, Annie helped Linda take another measured breath from the inhaler. Linda's shoulders had stopped pulling so hard with each breath, but the relief was thin, the kind that could vanish if the air turned against her again. How long? Annie asked without looking at him. 20 minutes, Richard said. Maybe less. Annie nodded, though her face tightened. A doctor coming here at this hour probably costs more than our rent. Do not think about the bill. That's easy for you to say. Richard accepted the words because they were true. He had said the same thing to many people over the years. Always as comfort, never realizing how empty it could sound to someone who measured life by what could be paid on Friday. Linda touched Annie's wrist. Annie, don't speak to him like that. No, Richard said. She has a right to. Annie looked at him, unsure what to do with that answer. She was used to defending herself. She was not used to being allowed to. Richard turned back toward the framed photograph on the table. The younger version of himself stared out from behind the glass, confident and impatient beside the black town car. Beside him stood Samuel Johnson, shoulders square, eyes direct, one hand resting lightly near the door handle. Richard remembered that hand. Samuel used it to open doors, carry luggage, steady an umbrella, stop an argument before it became something worse. He had been a driver by title. But never only that. How long did my father work for you? Annie asked. Almost 7 years. Her expression shifted. 7 years was too much time to be a footnote and too little for the life she had been told. He drove me during the years when Whitmore Holdings was becoming what it is now, Richard said. I was younger, less careful, more convinced I knew everything. Linda gave a faint breath that almost became a laugh. Sam said you were stubborn. Richard looked at her. He was generous. No, Linda said. He was accurate. For the first time that night, Richard almost smiled. It faded quickly. He had a way of correcting me without embarrassing me, Richard said. If I was late, he did not say I was late. He would say, Sir, people who wait too long start deciding whether they still respect you. If I snapped at someone, he would wait until we were in the car and say, A man can be busy without being small. Annie listened with both hands around the inhaler. The hurt in her face had changed. It was still there, but now it had been joined by hunger. The quiet hunger of someone hearing pieces of a person she had lost too early. "He said that?" she asked. "He said many things I should have listened to sooner." Linda closed her eyes. That was Sam. Richard drew a breath. The apartment seemed to press the past closer around him. The night he saved me was in October. I remember because the city had just turned cold. I had hosted a dinner at my house. Investors, lawyers, 2 men from Boston who wanted to take half my company and call it guidance. Samuel drove the last guest out and came back through the service entrance because I had left some papers in the car. Annie sat slowly on the edge of the bed, still close enough to Linda to help her. What happened? 3 men had entered through the back of the house. They knew where the office was. They knew there was a safe. It was not random. Richard looked at the photograph again. I came downstairs because I heard glass. I was angry before I was afraid. That was my mistake. I thought anger made me in control. Linda opened her eyes. Sam heard them too? He saw one of them before I did. Richard's voice lowered. There was a man in the hallway. I turned the corner, and Samuel pulled me back so hard I hit the wall. I remember being furious for half a second. Then I saw the weapon. Annie's fingers tightened around the inhaler. Richard noticed and kept the details careful. Samuel shoved me behind him. He told me to get down and stay there. I didn't listen fast enough. He pushed me again. The next few seconds were confusion, noise, broken glass, men shouting. Samuel kept himself between me and the danger until security came through the side entrance. Linda turned her face away, but Richard still saw the pain move across it. He came home with bruises, she said quietly. A cut on his shoulder. He told me there had been an accident with the car door. Richard shut his eyes briefly. He lied to protect me from owing him too much. He lied because he didn't want me afraid, Linda said. Annie looked at her mother. You knew? Not all of it. Linda's voice was thin, but steady. I knew enough to know your father had done something brave and didn't want applause for it. Richard sat back down on the chair, though he did not rest. I offered him money, a promotion, a house, anything he wanted. He said no to most of it. That sounds like him, Annie said. He accepted medical leave when the old injury bothered him. Later, when he got sick, I was told arrangements were being made. Support for the family, expenses covered. I signed what I was given. I thought it was handled. Annie's eyes dropped to the bills on the table. It wasn't. No, Richard said. It wasn't. The words sat between them with more weight than accusation. Linda did not accuse him. Annie did not either. Somehow that made it worse. Richard looked at Linda. Why didn't you contact my office? Linda took a careful breath. I tried once after Sam passed. The number I had sent me through 3 people. One said someone would call back. No one did. Then we had to move. After that, I had no time to chase men in offices. I had a funeral bill, a sick body, and a daughter who still needed supper. Annie looked down when her mother said supper, as if remembering meals stretched too thin. Richard's jaw tightened. I should have come myself. You were running a company, Linda said. That is not an excuse. No, Linda said softly. But it is what happened. Annie stood and went to the small sink for water. She moved slowly now, the rush finally catching up with her. She filled a glass, brought it to Linda, then glanced at Richard. My father saved your life, she said, and tonight you thought I was trying to cheat you out of $5. There was no anger in her voice. That made it cut deeper. Yes, Richard said. I did. Annie nodded once, accepting the truth because there was nothing else to do with it. That hurt. I know. No, she said. You know it was wrong. That's not the same. Richard looked at her then. Really looked. The thin coat, the tired shoes, the face still marked by humiliation, but not defeated by it. Samuel's daughter had his spine. Richard saw it now and wondered how he had missed it in the pharmacy. You are right, he said. I do not know what it felt like. Annie seemed surprised that he did not defend himself. A knock sounded at the open door. A woman in a dark coat stood outside with a medical bag in one hand and a stethoscope around her neck. "Dr. Elaine Porter," she said. "Mr. Whitmore called me." Annie stepped back at once, worried again. "She's on the bed." Her breathing got better after the inhaler, but it was bad before. Dr. Porter entered with calm efficiency. She greeted Linda by name, asked short questions, checked her pulse, listened to her lungs, and looked around the apartment without saying what everyone already understood. "How long has this window been leaking air?" the doctor asked. Linda looked embarrassed. "A while. And the heater?" "It works when it wants to," Annie said. Dr. Porter glanced at Richard, then back at Linda. "Mrs. Johnson, you need a hospital tonight. Not because anyone failed here, but because your lungs are working too hard and this apartment is not helping you recover." Annie's face drained. "Hospital means paperwork. Bills. We can't." "I'll handle it," Richard said. Annie turned sharply. "You keep saying that." "Because I mean it." Linda tried to sit higher. "Mr. Whitmore, please understand. I won't have my daughter carrying debt because of me." Richard stepped closer, but kept his voice low. "Mrs. Johnson, your husband once stood between me and a danger I did not see coming. Tonight I am standing here because your daughter asked for $5 she should never have had to ask for. This is not charity. This is a debt arriving late." Linda looked at him for a long time. Her pride fought with her exhaustion, and exhaustion was winning. Annie whispered, "Mama, please." That word did what Richard's money could not. Linda looked at her daughter's face and stopped resisting. "All right," she said, "but Annie stays with me." Dr. Porter nodded. "She can ride along." Richard took out his phone again. "I'll have a car brought closer." "No," Dr. Porter said. "I called medical transport on my way. She needs oxygen during the ride." Annie moved fast after that, gathering Linda's sweater, her ID, the prescription slip, and a small plastic bag with 2 pill bottles inside. She checked everything twice. Richard saw her slip the pharmacy receipt into her pocket, the same receipt that proved she still owed him $5. A few minutes later, footsteps sounded on the metal stairs. Medical workers arrived with equipment and moved carefully through the narrow doorway. Annie stood back only when asked. Her hands clenched at her sides. As they prepared Linda to leave, Richard picked up the framed photograph of Samuel and set it upright on the table. The man in the picture looked out at the room with the same steady gaze Richard remembered. Linda noticed. Sam would hate all this fuss. Richard kept his eyes on the photograph. He would have helped anyway. "Yes," Linda said. "He would have." When they carried Linda toward the walkway, Annie followed close, one hand on the blanket near her mother's shoulder. At the door, she paused and looked back at Richard. "Are you coming?" The question was small, but it changed the air between them. Richard slipped the aspirin bottle from his pocket and set it on the table beside Samuel's picture. He had no use for it now. "Yes," he said. "I'm coming." The medical workers carried Linda down the metal stairs with Annie close behind them, one hand hovering near the blanket as if her touch alone could keep her mother steady. Richard followed a few steps back. The walkway smelled of old paint, damp concrete, and cooking oil from another apartment. A door opened halfway on the first floor, and an older man in a robe looked out, then lowered his eyes when he saw the stretcher. "She all right?" he asked. Annie answered before anyone else could. "She will be." The man nodded, not convinced but respectful enough not to ask more. "Tell your mama I'm praying." "I will, Mr. Lewis." That small exchange told Richard something he had not understood when he first saw the building. People here noticed one another. They might not have much to give, but they noticed. He thought of his own building downtown, where neighbors rode private elevators and could live above one another for years without knowing a name. At the bottom of the stairs, Dr. Porter walked beside Linda, while a paramedic checked the oxygen line. Annie stayed near the stretcher until the back doors of the medical van opened. Then she froze. "What is it?" Richard asked. Annie looked at the equipment inside, then at her mother's thin face beneath the hallway light. "I forgot her purse. I'll get it." "No." Annie turned quickly. "I'll go. Her ID is in there. Insurance card too, even if it doesn't cover much." She ran back up before Richard could answer. He watched her move through exhaustion with the same urgency she had shown at the pharmacy. Every step said she had been doing this too long. Linda's eyes opened slightly. "Mr. Whitmore?" Richard stepped closer. "I'm here." Don't let her blame herself. She shouldn't. She will. Linda's breath moved carefully through the oxygen mask. Annie thinks if she works hard enough, nothing bad can reach us. Her father was like that. Took every burden and called it duty. Richard looked up toward the second-floor walkway where Annie had disappeared. Samuel carried more than I knew. Yes, Linda said. But he carried it standing straight. A few moments later, Annie returned with a worn purse tucked under her arm and a plastic bag of medicine in her hand. She climbed into the van beside Linda without asking permission. Dr. Porter looked at Richard. Northside Community, I'll call ahead. Richard nodded. I'll follow. Annie looked toward him from inside the van. You don't have to. I know. She seemed ready to argue, then looked at Linda and stopped. Okay. The van doors closed. Richard stood on the curb as it pulled away, red lights moving over the brick walls of the Mason Street units. His driver had brought the sedan closer and was waiting with the rear door open. Richard got in, but he did not settle into the seat the way he usually did. He sat forward, eyes on the medical van ahead. Northside Community Hospital, he said. Yes, sir. The drive was short, but it gave Richard too much time to think. The city passed by in uneven layers. Closed storefronts, late buses, diners with tired workers wiping counters, apartment windows glowing above dark sidewalks. Richard had seen these streets from behind tinted glass for years. Tonight they looked less like scenery and more like evidence. He remembered Samuel's steady voice in the car after long meetings. A man can be busy without being small. At the time, Richard had taken it as a clever remark from a loyal employee. Now it sounded like a warning he had ignored. At the hospital entrance, Annie was already out of the van, walking beside Linda's stretcher as staff guided them inside. Richard followed through sliding doors into the emergency department. The smell of disinfectant hit him first, then the layered noise, phones ringing, wheels over tile, a nurse calling for a chart, someone coughing behind a curtain. Annie handed over Linda's ID with both hands. The woman at intake asked for information, and Annie answered quickly, as if speed might make them safer. Address: Mason Street Units, Apartment 2C. Emergency contact? Me. Insurance? Annie gave the card and added before the woman could ask, It doesn't cover much, but she has it. Richard saw her shoulders tighten, waiting for the cost to enter the room like another illness. The intake woman looked at the card, then at the screen. We'll get her seen first. Annie nodded. Thank you. A nurse led Linda through double doors. Annie tried to follow, but another nurse stopped her gently. We'll call you back as soon as we can. She gets scared if she wakes up and I'm not there, Annie said. I understand. Give us a few minutes. Annie stood there after the doors closed, still holding the purse, the medicine bag, and the folded receipt from the pharmacy. Richard came beside her, but not too close. She is in the right place, he said. Annie looked at the doors. That's what people say when they can afford the right place. Richard had no answer that would not sound weak. They sat in the waiting area. Annie chose a chair near the doors, so she could stand quickly when called. Richard sat one seat away. A television mounted in the corner played a late news segment, with the sound low. Across the room, an older woman slept with a sweater folded under her head. A man in work boots rubbed his hands together and stared at the floor. Annie opened her mother's purse and began sorting papers. ID. Insurance card. Clinic notes. A folded list of medications. 2 bus passes. A photograph of Samuel, smaller than the one in the apartment. Richard noticed how careful she was with that picture. You carry that with her? He asked. Annie glanced at it. Mama does. She says if she ever has to make a hard decision, she likes to remember what Daddy would have told her. What would he have told her tonight? Annie pressed the photo between her palms. To go to the hospital before it got this bad. Linda had known that too. So had Annie. The difference was money. A doctor came out after nearly half an hour. Dr. Porter was with him. Annie stood so fast the papers nearly slid from her lap. She's stable, Dr. Porter said first, and Annie's face changed at that single word. She's responding to treatment, but her oxygen levels were lower than I like. We're admitting her overnight, possibly longer, depending on the chest x-ray. Is it pneumonia? Annie asked. Early signs. We caught it before it became worse. but she needs medication, monitoring, and rest. Annie nodded, taking in every word. Can I see her? In a few minutes. Richard spoke then. Doctor, what caused the decline? Dr. Porter looked from him to Annie, then answered plainly. Asthma can worsen for many reasons, but the apartment is part of it. Damp air, dust, poor heat, possible mold. If she goes back there too soon, she may end up right back here. Annie's lips pressed together. We can clean it. Dr. Porter's face softened. Annie, this is not about sweeping harder. The words landed quietly, but Richard saw their effect. Annie looked down as if the floor had accused her. All those hours cleaning, folding, wiping, trying to make poverty look manageable. And still the room itself had been working against her mother's lungs. Richard said, She won't go back there. Annie turned toward him. You can't just say that. I can say it if I mean to do something about it. We're not one of your business problems. No, he said. You are Samuel Johnson's family. Her eyes flashed. We were his family before you knew we existed. Richard accepted the rebuke. Yes. And I should have known sooner. Dr. Porter excused herself to check on Linda. Annie sat back down slowly, the fight leaving her only because exhaustion took its place. Richard waited before speaking again. Annie. She did not look at him. I am going to make some calls. Of course you are, she said. Men like you always make calls. This one matters. She gave a tired breath. I'm sure they all do. Richard looked at the double doors where Linda had been taken. Your mother needs a safe place to recover. She needs treatment without wondering whether a bill will push you out of your apartment. You need rest. You may not want my help, and after tonight I understand why. But I cannot stand here knowing who your father was and do nothing. Annie finally looked at him. You keep bringing up my father like that makes it easier. No, it makes it harder. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Annie unfolded the pharmacy receipt and smoothed it on her knee. I still owe you $5. Richard looked at the receipt, then at her face. She was holding on to that debt because it was one thing she could control. All right, he said. She blinked. All right? You owe me $5. I will not forget. The answer steadied her more than forgiveness would have. Good. But until then, Richard said, let me do what should have been done years ago. Annie looked toward the hospital doors again. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Just don't make promises you won't keep. Richard felt Samuel's photograph in the room, though it was in Annie's hand. He thought of the letters returned, the files closed, the help that never arrived. I won't, he said. This time, Annie did not thank him. She only nodded once, and for Richard, that small nod felt like the first trust he had earned all night. Annie stayed in the waiting area after Richard stepped away to make his calls. She kept her mother's purse on her lap, and the pharmacy receipt folded beneath her thumb. Every few minutes, she looked toward the double doors where Linda had disappeared. No one had told her to leave, but she still sat as if someone might come and ask why she was taking up space. Richard stood near the vending machines with his phone to his ear. He spoke quietly, but his tone had changed since the pharmacy. There was no impatience now, only control. I need Dr. Porter kept on the case. Yes, tonight. And I want billing directed to my office, not to Mrs. Johnson. No, not later. Now. Annie heard enough to understand, and enough to feel uneasy. She looked down at her shoes. Her father had taught her that help was not shameful, but dependence could become a chain if a person was not careful. She did not know Richard Whitmore. She knew he had lent her $5, followed her home, recognized her father, and called a doctor when her mother needed one. That was more than most people would have done, but it was also too much to understand in one night. When Richard returned, Annie had arranged all of Linda's papers into neat stacks on the chair beside her. You don't have to fix everything before morning, he said. I'm not fixing everything. She kept her eyes on the papers. I'm making sure nothing gets lost. Has that happened before? Annie gave a small, tired smile without humor. Things get lost when people don't have time to chase them. Richard sat one chair away. You sound like your mother. I sound like Bill's. She regretted it as soon as she said it and glanced at him. Sorry. No need. She folded the insurance card into a clinic form. I don't mean to be rude. You have been more polite tonight than I deserved. That made her pause. She looked at him, trying to decide whether he was being sincere. His face gave little away, but his voice did not carry the coldness from the pharmacy. You really knew my father? She asked. Yes. Not just from the picture? No. Annie's fingers moved over the edge of the purse. People say things when someone dies. They make them sound bigger than they were. Richard nodded. Samuel did not need anyone to make him bigger. She looked away toward the nurse's station. Mama says he was steady. That's the word she uses. Not perfect. Steady. That is a good word for him. What was he like at work? Richard thought before answering. Annie noticed and appreciated that he did not rush to hand her something polished. He arrived early, he said. Always. If I told him 8, he was there by 7:30. He knew which coffee shop kept the lid tight enough not to spill in the car. He knew which reporters asked fair questions and which ones only wanted blood. He knew when to speak and when silence would do more good. Annie listened with her head slightly lowered, as if each detail had to be caught carefully. He ever talk about me? Richard's face softened. Just a little. He kept a small photograph of you clipped to the visor. Annie blinked. He did? You were missing a front tooth in the picture. Pink sweater. 2 pigtails. Her mouth opened, then closed again. She looked down quickly, but she still did not cry. Mama has that picture. I didn't know he carried one. He showed it to me once when we were waiting outside a hotel. Said you had asked why the moon followed the car. Annie's lips trembled into the faintest smile. I remember asking that. He said he told you the moon liked good company. This time Annie had to press her fingers to her mouth for a second. The waiting room continued around them. A nurse crossing with a clipboard, the television muttering, the vending machine clicking as someone bought a soda. But for Annie, the chair beside her no longer held only a billionaire who had doubted her. It held someone who had known a living part of her father. She lowered her hand. He got sick after the injury? Richard's expression changed. Not right away. The injury weakened him. He kept working longer than he should have. He would. I should have stopped him. You were his boss, not his keeper. A decent man knows when the difference no longer matters. Annie studied him. Did you ever visit him after he left? Richard did not look away. Once. At your old apartment. He was thinner, still wearing a pressed shirt like he had somewhere important to be. I told him there would be support for medical costs. He told me not to fuss over him. That sounds like Daddy. I let that make it easier to step back. Annie said nothing. Richard continued because the truth had already begun, and stopping now would only protect him. After he died, I was told your family had moved. I signed instructions for my office to locate you. I believed they had. Then years passed, and I allowed other urgent matters to cover what should have remained urgent. Annie's voice became quiet. We waited for a while. Richard turned toward her. Not for money, she said quickly. Mama never said it like that. But after the funeral, she kept checking the mail. She said maybe some paperwork would come through, maybe something from his job. Then rent got behind, and we moved. After that, she stopped checking. Richard's hands closed slowly. Annie, she didn't blame you, Annie said. I did. Sometimes. But I didn't even know who you were. I just blamed whoever had been important enough for Daddy to get hurt, protecting. The words were not cruel. That made them worse. Before Richard could answer, Dr. Porter returned from the double doors. Annie stood at once. She's asking for you, the doctor said. She's tired, but she can talk for a minute. We've started treatment. Her breathing is improving. Annie's shoulders lowered for the first time all night. Can I go in? Yes, just keep it short. Annie gathered the purse and papers, then hesitated and looked at Richard. Should he come too? Dr. Porter looked at Richard, then back at Annie. That's up to your mother. Annie went through the doors first. Richard followed only after Dr. Porter gave him a small nod. Linda was propped up in a hospital bed, an oxygen tube beneath her nose, her skin still drawn but less strained. Annie went to her side and took her hand. Hey, Mama. Linda squeezed weakly. You ate today? Annie let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. That's what you're asking? Yes. No. Linda looked at Richard. See? She mothers me and forgets herself. I can arrange food, Richard said. Annie turned. I don't need you to arrange food. Linda's eyes moved between them. You two already sound tired of each other. For the first time that night, the room held something close to warmth. Richard stepped closer to the foot of the bed. Mrs. Johnson, Dr. Porter says you are improving. Because Annie got the medicine. Yes, Richard said. Because Annie got the medicine. Linda looked at her daughter. How much did you have to ask for? Annie's eyes lowered. $5. Litha closed her eyes. The shame crossed her face before she could stop it. Lord, Mama, don't. I never wanted you standing in front of strangers asking for money. I know. Linda opened her eyes and looked at Richard. She'll pay you back. I know, Richard said. Annie looked at him, surprised again. Linda studied his face. Sam talked about you. Richard's throat tightened. I wish I had heard more of what he said. He said you were a hard man, but not a lost one. Richard could not answer. Linda breathed carefully, gathering strength for the rest. He said if anything ever happened to him, I should not be too proud to ask decent people for help. Then when it did happen, I got too proud anyway. Annie shook her head. You were doing your best. So were you. Linda's hand tightened around hers. But best doesn't always pay for medicine. The sentence settled over all three of them. Richard looked at Linda, then at Annie. Mrs. Johnson, I cannot undo the years you were left alone. I will not pretend I can. But I can make sure tonight does not become another door closed in your face. Linda's eyes sharpened despite her exhaustion. And what does that mean? It means the hospital bill goes to me. It means you do not return to that apartment until a doctor says it is safe. And if it is not safe, you do not return at all. It means I review what was promised after Samuel's service and why it failed to reach you. Linda turned her face away slightly. That sounds like charity dressed in better clothes. Annie looked down. Richard accepted that too. Then let me say it plainly. This is not charity. This is overdue. Linda looked back at him. Overdue things still come with strings. Not this. Rich men don't usually give without wanting something. Richard glanced at Annie. Tonight, your daughter asked me for $5 and still promised to pay it back. I understand strings better than I did 2 hours ago. Linda watched him for a long moment. Sam trusted you once. I know. Don't make me regret trusting what he saw. I won't. A nurse entered and said Linda needed rest. Annie leaned close and kissed her mother's forehead. I'm right outside. Eat something, Linda whispered. I will. Linda gave Richard one last look before closing her eyes. Make sure she does. In the hallway, Annie stopped near the wall. She held herself still for 3 seconds, then finally let the breath out. Richard stood beside her. There is a cafeteria downstairs. I don't have money for hospital food. I didn't ask. She turned to him, tired and wary, but not as guarded as before. I'm not good at this. At what? Being helped. Richard thought of Samuel refusing reward after saving his life. He thought of Linda apologizing from a hospital bed. He thought of Annie standing in a pharmacy with $10 and a trembling prescription slip. No, he said. You come from people who made it difficult. Annie looked toward her mother's room. My father would have paid you back already. Richard held her gaze. Your father saved my life. I am the one behind on payment. Annie did not smile, but some of the fight left her face. After a moment, she opened her hand. The folded receipt was still there. Tomorrow, she said. Richard nodded. Tomorrow. Then, for the first time all night, Annie let someone walk beside her without trying to carry everything alone. By the time Annie finished half a turkey sandwich from the hospital cafeteria, the night had thinned toward morning. She ate because Linda had told her to, not because she wanted food. Richard sat across from her with a paper cup of black coffee cooling beside his hand. He had bought the meal without asking permission and placed it on the table as if making a business decision. But he did not tell her to eat. That was the only reason she accepted it. You don't have to stay here, Annie said after a long stretch of quiet. Richard looked at her. I know. You keep saying that, because you keep giving me chances to leave. She glanced down at the sandwich wrapper. Most people take them. Richard thought of the pharmacy counter, the $5 bill, the way he had almost taken the easiest version of decency, and walked away. I almost did. But you didn't. No, he said, not far enough. Annie did not answer. She folded the receipt from the pharmacy again and slid it into the pocket of her coat. The motion was small, but Richard noticed. She was tired enough to shake when she reached for the paper cup of water. Yet she still guarded that receipt like proof of who she was. A nurse came to the cafeteria entrance and called her name. Annie stood at once. "Your mother is resting," the nurse said. "She asked me to tell you not to sit up all night staring at the door." Annie's face softened. "That sounds like her. She also said to tell you she means it." "I'll try." The nurse smiled in the tired way hospital nurses did when they had seen too many families pretend not to be afraid. "That's good enough for now." After she left, Richard checked his watch. It was nearly 5. His office would begin waking within an hour. People would send messages, ask questions, expect decisions. For once, none of that felt urgent enough. "I need to go downtown," he said. Annie looked up quickly, then tried to hide the reaction. "Okay, not to leave this alone, to find out what happened after your father died." Her guarded look returned. "What do you mean?" "I mean there should be records, employment files, medical leave documents, benefit instructions. My office was told to locate your family, and they didn't." "I don't know that yet." Annie looked at him with the first real bitterness he had heard from her. "We were not hard to lose, Mr. Whitmore. People lose families like mine all the time." Richard took that in without defending anyone. "Then I need to know who stopped looking." She studied him, as if trying to decide whether anger or hope was more dangerous. "And if the answer is nobody? What if everyone just did a little bit wrong and then went home?" "Then I will start there." Annie nodded once, but her eyes stayed tired. "Please don't make my father into a file." "I won't. He was a person before he was your driver." Richard held her gaze. "Yes, he was. He left the hospital after checking with Dr. Porter and making sure Annie had a number that would reach him directly. His driver was waiting outside, posture straight despite the hour. The city had begun to turn gray at the edges. Delivery trucks moved along the curb. A bus released 3 nurses near the entrance. Richard got into the sedan with the smell of hospital coffee still on his coat. "Office, sir?" the driver asked. "Yes." The Whitmore Holdings Tower stood in the center of downtown, tall and clean against the morning sky. Richard entered through the private lobby, where the security guard straightened at once. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore." "Morning." His assistant, Margaret Ellis, was already at her desk outside his office, though her start time was still 40 minutes away. She had been with him long enough to know when a message sent before dawn meant the day would not be ordinary. "I pulled what I could from archived personnel," she said, standing. "Samuel Johnson, driver, hired in 2004, medical leave in 2011, departure recorded in 2012. Richard stopped in front of her desk. "Death?" Noted informally in a later correspondence. No formal family contact after that. Richard's expression hardened. "Bring everything." Margaret followed him into his office with a tablet and a thin stack of printed pages. The city stretched behind the windows, but Richard did not look at it. He stood at his desk while she placed the documents in front of him. "There was a support package drafted," Margaret said. "Medical assistance, survivor payment, education support for dependent family. It appears you approved it." "I remember approving it." She hesitated. Richard looked at her. "Say it." "The delivery failed. Letters were sent to the last known address. Returned. A phone number was disconnected. The file was transferred between Employee Relations, Legal Review, and the Charitable Foundation. After 90 days, it was marked pending. After 1 year, dormant." "Dormant," Richard repeated. Margaret's face showed she disliked the word too. "That is the term used. A man saves my life, dies sick, leaves a wife and daughter behind, and my company calls them dormant? I'm sorry. Do not apologize for a word you did not write. Find the person who did." Margaret tapped the tablet. The final review was signed by Charles Benton. Richard looked up. Charles Benton had served Whitmore Holdings for years as a risk management officer before moving into a senior advisory role. Careful, polished, always speaking of exposure, precedent, and containment. Richard had trusted him with matters that needed discretion. "Get Benton here," Richard said. "It is early." "Then wake him." Margaret nodded and stepped out. Richard sat only after she left. He opened the first file. Samuel Johnson's employment photo appeared at the top of the page. Younger than in Annie's apartment photograph, but with the same steady gaze. Richard remembered Samuel standing beside the car on cold mornings, coffee ready, schedule memorized, never making Richard feel watched but always making sure he was protected. He turned the page. Incident report. Security breach. Injuries sustained. Medical follow-up recommended. Richard read the language twice. The report made Samuel's actions sound procedural, as if he had merely performed a task. It did not say he had stepped between danger and a man too arrogant to duck. It did not say he went home hurt and lied to spare his wife fear. Margaret returned 20 minutes later with Charles Benton beside her. Benton wore a navy suit, no tie, his gray hair combed too neatly for a man summoned at dawn. "Richard," Benton said. Margaret said it was urgent. Richard did not invite him to sit. Samuel Johnson. Benton's brow tightened as he searched the name. Former driver? You remember him? Vaguely. It was years ago. He saved my life. Yes, of course. The security incident. Benton shifted his weight. A terrible night. Richard pushed the file across the desk. His family never received the support I approved. Benton glanced at the papers. If the address was invalid, there were limits to what could be done. Limits? Reasonable limits. We cannot chase every former employee's family indefinitely, especially when documentation becomes uncertain. Richard's voice stayed low. His wife called once. Benton looked up. She was passed through 3 people. No one called back. That would be unfortunate. Unfortunate is a late lunch. This was a widow and her daughter. Benton's mouth tightened. Richard. With respect, emotion can distort old matters. If we reopen every dormant file, we expose the company to claims, expectations, perhaps litigation. We must be careful about precedent. Richard looked at him for a long second. There it is. What? The word you cared about more than his name. Benton drew a breath. My job was to protect the company. No, Richard said. Your job was to protect the company's word. You chose the cheaper version. The office air sharpened. Margaret stood near the door, still as stone. Benton straightened. I followed policy. Then the policy was wrong, and you hid behind it. I did not hide. You delayed. You deferred. You let time do what you did not want your signature to do. Benton's face colored. That is unfair. Richard closed the file. Justice that arrives only when convenient is not justice. It is decoration. No one spoke. Richard turned to Margaret. Open every support file marked dormant in the last 20 years. Former staff, injured staff, deceased staff. Anyone promised assistance after service to this company. I want names, families, amounts approved, amounts paid, and who closed the file. That will take time, she said. Then start now. Benton's eyes narrowed. This could become expensive. Richard looked at him. It already was. Other people paid it. Margaret left to begin the audit. Benton stayed, but something in his stance had changed. He understood this was not a passing mood. And my role? He asked. Suspended from all advisory duties related to employee risk, benefits, and foundation oversight. Richard, go home, Charles. I will call when I know how much damage your caution did. Benton left without another word. Richard remained at his desk after the door closed. He looked again at Samuel's photograph on the personnel page, then reached for his phone and typed a message to Annie. I found the file. It was not handled properly. I am going to fix what I can. He stared at the words before sending them. They were not enough. He knew that. But for the first time in years, he was not letting not enough become an excuse for doing nothing. At the hospital, Annie read the message from a plastic chair outside her mother's room. She did not smile. She did not cry. She only folded the phone in both hands, looked toward Linda's door, and whispered, Daddy, he found it. Annie remained outside Linda's room until a nurse finally told her she could go in. The message from Richard still sat on her phone, short and heavy. I found the file. It was not handled properly. I am going to fix what I can. She had read it 4 times and still did not know whether it made her feel relieved or angry. Her father's life had become a file somewhere in a downtown tower. And now the man who owned that tower was saying the file had been mishandled, as if a family could be misplaced like a receipt. Linda was awake when Annie entered. Her color had improved, though the oxygen tube beneath her nose made Annie's chest tighten again. A breakfast tray sat untouched near the bed. Scrambled eggs, toast, a small cup of fruit, coffee gone lukewarm. "You didn't eat," Annie said. Linda turned her head. "Neither did you, probably. I had a sandwich." "A whole one?" "Half." Linda gave her a look. Annie sat beside the bed and took the plastic fork from the tray. "Fine. I'll eat the toast if you eat the eggs." "That sounds like a bad deal for me." "It's the deal on the table." Linda let out a soft breath that nearly became a laugh. Annie cut the eggs into smaller bites and helped her with the first few. They moved slowly, like both of them were afraid to trust the calmer rhythm of the morning. After a while, Linda looked at Annie's hand. "You're squeezing that phone like it owes you money." Annie loosened her grip. "Mr. Whitmore texted." Linda waited. "He found Daddy's file. He said it wasn't handled right." Linda closed her eyes, not in surprise. More like the words had confirmed something she had carried quietly for years. "What does that mean?" Annie asked. "It means what I thought it meant when the letters stopped coming." Linda opened her eyes again. "Somebody put us down on paper and then stopped looking." Annie's jaw tightened. "You should have told me. You were trying to pass algebra and keep your work shoes from falling apart." "I wasn't going to hand you one more disappointment. I'm not made of glass, Mama." "No," Linda said. "You're made of too much responsibility. That worries me more." Before Annie could answer, a knock came at the door. Richard stood outside with a paper cup of coffee in one hand and a folder tucked beneath his arm. He did not step in until Linda gave a small nod. "Good morning," he said. Linda looked toward the window. "It's morning already?" "Almost 8. Annie stood. "You came back. I said I would. You also said you were making calls." "I made them." Annie glanced at the folder. "Is that my father?" "Some of it." Richard placed the folder on the counter near the sink, not on Linda's bed. "But I did not come here to bury you in paperwork before breakfast." Linda studied him. "Then why did you come?" "To speak plainly. That would be a good change from most offices." Richard accepted the edge in her voice. "Your medical care will be covered. Not by you. Not by Annie." Linda's face closed at once. "Mr. Whitmore, please let me finish. I know how these things sound when people with money say them. Covered. Handled. Taken care of. Then later, there is fine print." "No fine print. There is always fine print." Annie looked between them, tense and quiet. Richard pulled a chair closer but did not sit until Linda gave another nod. "The support package for Samuel's family was approved years ago. It was never delivered. That is not your failure. It is mine and my company's. I cannot change the years, but I can make sure you are not punished again for our negligence." Linda's fingers tightened around the blanket. "You call it negligence because that sounds clean." Richard lowered his eyes for a moment. "You are right." Annie looked at him sharply. She had expected him to defend the word. Richard continued. "It was neglect. It was delay. It was a promise left to people who treated it like paperwork instead of a family. I am not proud of that." Linda watched him, her breathing steady but shallow. "And now the hospital bill comes to my office. Dr. Porter will oversee the treatment plan. When you leave here, you will not return to Mason Street until the apartment is inspected. If it is unsafe, you will not go back." Annie's voice came fast. "Where are we supposed to go? I have arranged a short-term apartment near the hospital." "No." Annie shook her head before he finished. "We can't just move into a place you arranged." Richard looked at her. "Why not?" "Because that's how people lose control. First it's a room, then it's rules. Then someone gets to say we owe them more than we agreed to." Linda looked at Annie with pain and pride mixed together. "Baby." "No, Mama. I know he helped us. I know Daddy saved him, but we still have to be careful." Richard did not interrupt. Annie's voice had risen, but it was not disrespect. It was fear wearing work clothes, standing straight because it had no other choice. "You are right to be careful," he said. That stopped her. Richard opened the folder and removed one sheet. "The apartment is in the name of the Samuel Johnson Family Trust. I established it this morning as an emergency measure while the full review is ongoing. You will not sign anything today. You will not agree to terms you do not understand. I will have an independent legal aid attorney meet with you, someone not paid by Whitmore Holdings, so you can hear what your rights are before deciding. Annie frowned. Why would you do that? Because help that makes you afraid is not help. Linda looked down, and for a moment she seemed older than she had the night before. Sam used to say something like that. Richard nodded. He said many things I was too busy to hear properly. Annie sat again, but not fully at ease. What about work? Richard looked at her. Yours? I have a breakfast shift. I already missed it. If I miss another one, Denise will try to be nice about it, but the owner won't. Nice doesn't keep a job open. I can call. No, Annie's answer was immediate. Please don't call my job as Richard Whitmore. I don't want people looking at me like I'm some story that walked in with a billionaire behind it. Richard considered that. Then you call. Tell them the truth. Your mother was admitted to the hospital. If you lose wages, the trust can cover emergency income. Annie shook her head. I don't want to be paid for not working. Linda sighed. Annie, I don't. Richard leaned forward slightly. Then let me offer something else. When your mother is stable, there is a community health support center funded by my foundation. They need intake assistance. Real work. Paid work. Training included. You would interview for it. No guarantee. No favor behind the desk. Just a chance. Annie's eyes narrowed. Why that kind of work? Because last night you knew what to do faster than I did. You kept your mother alive long enough for help to arrive. You understand people who are scared to ask for help. That matters. The compliment made her uncomfortable. She looked at Linda. I don't have office experience. You have experience, Linda said. Just not the kind people put in nice boxes. Richard added. You would not have to decide today. Annie looked at the breakfast tray, the folder, the oxygen tube, then the phone in her lap. Her life had changed too fast. The night before, her whole world had narrowed to $5 and an inhaler. Now a man she had met at a pharmacy was talking about trusts, apartments, legal aid, and job interviews. None of it felt real enough to hold. Linda reached for her hand. Listen to me. Pride kept me from going to the hospital sooner. Don't let pride make you refuse a door your father may have opened years ago. Annie's eyes went to Richard. That's what scares me. What if this is only happening because of Daddy? Richard answered carefully. It began because of him. It continues because of you and your mother. Annie looked down. I don't know how to accept that. You do not have to accept all of it at once. Linda gave Richard a tired look. That is the first sensible thing you have said. A small breath escaped Annie, almost a laugh, but it faded quickly. Richard stood. I'll leave the folder here. Read nothing until you have rested. Dr. Porter will come by later. The legal aid attorney can meet tomorrow if you agree. If you do not, nothing moves forward without your consent. Annie held up the pharmacy receipt. And this? Richard knew what she meant. The $5. He reached into his wallet, took out a business card, and placed it beside the tray. When you are ready to repay it, call that number. Linda looked at him. You're really going to let her pay you back? Yes. Good, Linda said. Then maybe she'll stop holding that paper like it's the deed to her soul. Annie tucked the receipt away, but her face eased a little. Tomorrow, she said. Richard nodded. Tomorrow is fine. At the door, he paused and looked back. Linda had started eating another bite of eggs. Annie was adjusting the blanket around her mother's feet, still tired, still wary, but no longer standing alone against everything. Richard stepped into the hall and closed the door halfway behind him. For the first time since seeing Samuel's photograph, he understood that writing checks would be the easy part. The harder part would be giving help in a way that did not take anything more from the people who had already lost too much. Annie did not sleep that morning. She tried because Linda told her to, because Dr. Porter said exhaustion made fear worse, and because Richard had arranged for a reclining chair to be brought near the bed without making a speech about it. But every time Annie closed her eyes, she saw the pharmacy counter, the white bag, the $5 bill sliding across the surface like a small mercy she had not wanted to need. By late morning, Linda was breathing easier. Her voice still had a rough edge, but she could speak without stopping after every few words. Annie sat beside her with a notebook open on her knees, writing down each instruction from the nurse. Steroid schedule, inhaler use, warning signs, follow-up appointments, food restrictions with the new medication. Linda watched her for a while. You're writing like there's going to be a test. There is, Annie said, not looking up. It's called keeping you out of here. The nurse, a woman in her 60s with gray hair pinned behind her head, smiled as she checked the IV line. That's not a bad answer, Linda sighed. She's been like this since she was little. If something scared her, she made a list. Annie kept writing. Lists work. Sometimes rest works too. I'll write that down. The nurse laughed softly. Honey, you are your mother's daughter. Annie paused at that. People used to say she was Samuel's daughter when she held a door open, arrived early, or refused to take something she had not earned. Hearing that she was Linda's daughter felt different. It reminded her that strength did not always stand tall in a driver's uniform. Sometimes it lay in a hospital bed and still worried whether someone else had eaten. Richard returned around noon with a plain paper bag from the cafeteria and a new notebook from the hospital gift shop. He did not hand it to Annie right away. He placed it on the side table beside her old one. For your notes, he said. Annie looked at it. I already have one. That one is almost full. She touched the edge of the new notebook but did not open it. How much was it? Annie, how much? $3.79. She reached for her pocket. Richard held up one hand. No, you said you understood. I understand the $5. I am not opening a bookstore account with you. Linda made a small sound from the bed. Let the man buy the notebook, Annie. Annie looked at her mother. You're taking his side now? I'm taking the side of common sense. It comes with age. Richard placed the cafeteria bag beside the notebook. There is soup in there, also crackers. For Mama? For both of you. Annie opened the bag and checked the containers. Did you eat? Richard hesitated. Linda pointed at him weakly. Don't start lying in a hospital room. I had coffee. That is not food, Linda said. Annie slid one container toward him. Then you can have half. Richard looked at the soup, then at her. Are you always this determined? When people don't listen, yes. My father used to say that, Richard said before he could stop himself. Linda's eyes softened. Your father? Richard's face changed. Just enough for Annie to notice the grief behind the name. He was not a patient man, but he believed stubbornness could be useful if aimed at the right thing. Annie handed him a plastic spoon, then aim it at lunch. For a few minutes, they ate without much talk. The soup was not special, but it was warm. Annie made sure Linda had enough, then ate her own slowly, as if food were something to manage instead of enjoy. Richard watched her count the crackers before setting 2 aside for later. You don't have to save those, he said. I know. You're saving them anyway. She looked at the crackers, then shrugged. Habit. Linda looked out the window. After Sam died, we learned to make things last. Richard set his spoon down. I am beginning to understand how much I did not see. Annie's face remained careful. Seeing now doesn't change then. No, he said. It does not. That answer seemed to matter to her. She did not want easy comfort. Easy comfort had never paid rent, filled medicine, or brought back anyone. Dr. Porter came in after lunch with a tablet and the firm manner of someone who preferred truth over comfort. She checked Linda's lungs, asked about pain, reviewed the treatment plan, then looked at Annie. You're keeping notes? Annie held up the notebook. Everything you say. Good. Then write this down too. Your mother can recover, but not if she goes back into the same air too soon. Damp walls, dust, poor heat, mold exposure, those are not small problems for someone with asthma. Annie wrote, but her hand slowed. Linda said, Doctor, we don't have another apartment sitting empty. I understand. That's why Mr. Whitmore asked me for a written medical recommendation. Dr. Porter glanced at Richard. I'll provide it, not as a favor, because it's medically necessary. Annie looked up. So if we leave Mason Street, it's because a doctor said so. Yes, Dr. Porter said, not because someone decided you weren't good enough for where you lived. The words caught Annie off guard. She looked down again quickly, but Richard saw how hard she was trying not to react. After Dr. Porter left, Linda reached for the notebook. Annie handed it over. Linda looked at the page filled with neat lines and small arrows. You could have been a nurse, Linda said. Annie took the notebook back too fast. Mama, you could still be. We're not doing that right now. Richard looked at her. Why not? Because right now she needs medicine, rent needs paying, and I have a job I can't keep missing. Linda's eyes stayed on her. That is not an answer. That is a wall. Annie closed the notebook. Walls are useful, Richard said. What did you want before everything became urgent? She looked at him as if the question were almost unfair. I wanted a lot of things before. Name one. Annie's fingers tightened on the notebook. Community nursing. Maybe clinic work. Nothing fancy. I know what it's like when people don't understand the forms, or they don't know which line to stand in, or they're embarrassed because they can't pay. I thought maybe I could be the person at the desk who didn't make them feel small. Linda looked at Richard. She never told strangers that. I'm not a stranger anymore? Richard asked. Annie answered before Linda could. Not exactly. It was not trust, not yet. But it was a step away from fear, Richard said. The center I mentioned has training programs. Intake. Patient navigation. Community health outreach. It could be a start, not a handout. Annie's eyes narrowed. Would people know you sent me? Only the director. And I can tell her nothing beyond your name and that you are applying. No special treatment. No special treatment. If I'm not good enough, I don't want the job. Then you will have to convince them you are. Linda smiled faintly. That won't be hard. Annie shook her head, but her face had changed. It was the smallest opening, a thought she had not allowed herself to hold in a long time. Later that afternoon, while Linda slept, Annie walked Richard to the elevator. She held the new notebook under one arm and the old receipt in her hand. You're still keeping that? Richard asked. Yes. You really will pay it back tomorrow. I said I would. I believe you. She looked at him then. You didn't last night. No. That hurt more than the money. I know. Annie took a breath. I don't want to stay angry forever. I don't have room for that. But I remember things. You should. My father did too, she said. Mama said he remembered who treated people well, when no one important was watching. Richard thought of Samuel opening car doors, reading rooms, standing in the way of danger without asking who would write it down. Your father remembered correctly. Annie folded the receipt once more, then placed it in the back of the notebook. Tomorrow, I'll pay the $5. After that, if you still want me to apply for that center, I'll go. Richard nodded. That sounds fair. It's not because I need saving. No, he said. It is because you have something to give. The elevator doors opened. Richard stepped inside, then turned back. Annie stood in the hall, tired, thin-coated, and still carrying more than she should. But now she held a notebook with blank pages, and for the first time since the pharmacy, Richard saw something beside fear in her face. Not relief. Not yet. Possibility. Richard returned to Whitmore Holdings with Annie's words still in his mind. After that, if you still want me to apply for that center, I'll go. It should have pleased him. Instead, it reminded him how carefully she measured every step, as if one wrong agreement might cost her something she could not replace. Margaret met him outside his office with 2 tablets and a stack of printed summaries. Her hair was pulled back tighter than usual, and there was a coffee cup on her desk that had gone untouched. You have the audit? Richard asked. The first layer, she said. It is worse than I expected. Richard did not sit. Show me. Margaret placed the first report on his desk. 28 dormant support cases in the last 20 years. 12 involved former employees who were injured while working for the company or while performing duties connected to company executives. 9 involved death benefits or family assistance that were approved but not fully delivered. 7 are still unclear. Richard's eyes stayed on the page. Samuel, listed as approved. Medical assistance, survivor payment, relocation support, and a dependent education fund. Payment status, partial processing. Final status, deferred. Who deferred it? Margaret looked at the second page. Charles Benton signed the review. Legal copied. Foundation copied. Employee relations marked follow-up complete after returned mail. Richard's hand rested on the edge of the desk. Returned mail is not follow-up. No, sir. Was money ever released? A small medical reimbursement before Mr. Johnson passed. Nothing after that. Richard looked toward the window, then back at the file. So Linda buried her husband, lost her home, raised Annie alone, and all the while there was an approved fund sitting inside this company. Margaret did not answer. There was no answer that improved the sentence. Get Benton back here, Richard said. He has already called twice. He wants legal present. Good. Bring legal too. Within half an hour, the conference room filled with people who had not planned to start their day defending old files. Charles Benton arrived in a dark suit and a controlled expression. Beside him sat Leonard Briggs from legal, a cautious man with silver glasses and a habit of touching his pen before answering anything. Margaret sat to Richard's right. Quiet but prepared, Richard placed Samuel's file in the center of the table. I want to understand how a promise became a dead file, he said. Leonard cleared his throat. Before we begin, I should advise that language matters here. We should avoid terms that imply fault until a full review is complete. Richard looked at him. A woman was breathing through a failing inhaler last night because our approved support never reached her. I will choose my language carefully, Leonard, but I will not choose it to protect cowardice. Charles shifted. This is exactly why I asked legal to attend. Richard turned to him, then speak. Charles folded his hands. Samuel Johnson's case was not mishandled with malice. It was complicated. The family moved. Contact information failed. We had no verified address, no response, and no clear documentation after a certain point. Margaret slid a sheet across the table. Mrs. Johnson called after her husband's death. The call log shows she reached employee relations. Charles glanced at the paper. A call log is not a completed claim. No, Richard said. It was a widow asking for help. Charles's mouth tightened. Richard, there are procedures for a reason. If we release funds without verification, we create exposure. We invite fraud. We set precedent. Samuel set a precedent when he put his body between me and a weapon. The room changed. No one moved. Charles lowered his voice. No one disputes his service. You reduced his service to risk. I protected the company. Richard leaned forward. You protected the company from keeping its word. Leonard spoke carefully. Mr. Whitmore, we need to distinguish between ethical obligation and legal obligation. Richard looked at him. That is how decent people lose their way. They split what is legal from what is right, then act surprised when the gap swallows someone. Margaret's eyes stayed on her notes, but Richard saw her fingers stop moving. Charles exhaled. This is personal for you. I understand that. But we cannot let emotion reopen every file in the archive. We already are. That will cost millions. Richard nodded once. Probably. And you are comfortable telling shareholders that? I am comfortable telling them we are paying debts we should have paid before. Charles gave a dry laugh. That is not how business works. Richard held his gaze. It is how mine will work from now on. No one spoke for several seconds. Outside the glass walls, the city kept moving, traffic shifting between towers, people crossing streets with coffees, badges, and work bags. Richard thought of Annie standing in the pharmacy with a $10 bill, being asked to prove she deserved 5 more. Up here, men had hidden behind words like process and exposure, while people beneath them carried the cost. Margaret opened another folder. There is more. Richard looked at her. Several deferred files were reviewed under a cost containment policy Benton proposed 15 years ago. It allowed unresolved support cases to be closed after 1 year if no successful contact was made. Richard turned to Charles. You wrote that policy? I recommended it. We had cases lingering indefinitely. People linger when they are sick, displaced, grieving, and poor. Richard said. They do not always answer letters on time. Charles's expression hardened. You are making this sound cruel. It was administrative. Administrative cruelty is still cruelty. It just wears a cleaner shirt. Leonard tapped his pen once, then stopped when Richard looked at him. Richard stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Effective immediately, the dormant closure policy is suspended. Every file affected by it will be reopened. Families will be located through outside investigators if necessary. Approved funds will be honored with interest. Medical support promised after injury or service will be reviewed case by case. Margaret will oversee the audit with independent counsel, not Mr. Benton. Charles's chair scraped back slightly. You cannot remove me from oversight without board review. I can remove your access pending review. This is reckless. No, Richard said. Reckless was letting the daughter of Samuel Johnson beg for $5 while our company preserved clean paperwork. Charles looked toward Leonard, but Leonard gave no rescue. Legal caution had limits when the chairman had already decided the moral ground. Richard continued. The program will be renamed the Samuel Johnson Family Trust until a wider employee support structure is formed. No press release, no media, no photographs. If anyone leaks this for reputation value, they answer to me. Margaret nodded. Understood. Charles's face reddened. You are turning a private mistake into a public liability. Richard's voice remained flat. No, I am turning a private failure into quiet repair. The meeting ended without ceremony. Leonard left with Margaret to draft the necessary documents. Charles stayed behind. You are letting one girl and one sad story rewrite policy, Charles said. Richard gathered Samuel's file. No. One girl showed me the policy had already rewritten too many lives. You think this makes you just? Richard paused at the door. No. Justice does not become fair because it finally arrives. Sometimes it arrives late. Carrying an apology it can never make large enough. For the first time, Charles had nothing ready to say. Richard returned to his office and closed the door. The building around him continued with its usual efficiency, but it no longer impressed him. Efficiency had failed Samuel. It had failed Linda. It had left Annie at a pharmacy counter defending her honesty for $5. He took Samuel's employment photo from the folder and set it on his desk. For a long moment, he looked at the man who had once warned him without preaching, corrected him without insulting, and saved him without asking to be praised. Richard picked up his phone and called Annie. She answered on the third ring. Mr. Whitmore? How is your mother? She's resting. Dr. Porter said her oxygen is better. Good. There was a brief pause. Did something happen? Yes, Richard said. I reopened your father's file. Annie was quiet. And others like it, he added. Your family was not the only one left waiting. Her voice came lower. So it happened to more people? Yes. What are you going to do? Find them, pay what was promised, change the policy that allowed it. Another pause. He could hear the hospital behind her, soft footsteps, a cart rolling somewhere nearby. My father would have cared about that, Annie said. I know. He didn't like people being forgotten. Richard looked at Samuel's photo. Neither do I. Not anymore. Annie breathed out slowly. Mama's asleep. I'll tell her when she wakes up. Annie. Yes? Your interview at the community center can wait until she is stronger. I know, she said. But I don't want it to wait too long. For the first time that day, Richard felt something in him ease. Then it won't, he said. After the call ended, Richard remained at his desk with Samuel's file open in front of him. Outside, the city moved as it always had, but Richard no longer saw only buildings, contracts, and routes to profit. He saw lives attached to decisions, families behind paperwork, and a girl with a pharmacy receipt folded like a promise. He had once believed power meant making things happen quickly. Now he understood something slower and harder. Power meant going back to the people left behind and refusing to call the delay acceptable. Linda was discharged 2 days later with a paper bag of medication, a folder of instructions, and a warning from Dr. Porter that sounded gentle only because her voice was calm. No Mason Street, the doctor said, looking first at Linda, then at Annie. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Depending on the inspection. Your lungs need clean air, steady heat, and rest. I am writing that down because I know both of you are better at arguing than listening. Linda gave a tired smile. You've known us 3 days, doctor. That was enough. Annie held the discharge papers close to her chest. She had read every line twice and underlined the medication schedule in the new notebook Richard had bought. She still planned to pay him back for the $5, but she had stopped trying to pay for the notebook. Linda had said she was making herself tired over the wrong debt, and for once Annie had no energy to argue. Richard waited near the hospital entrance in a dark coat, his driver standing beside the sedan. He did not approach until Annie saw him first. You came, she said. I said I would help with the move. Linda raised one eyebrow. Move is a big word for 2 bags and a sick woman. Richard looked toward the small suitcase Annie carried and the plastic grocery bag with Linda's slippers inside. Then I came for the 2 bags. Annie almost smiled, but caught herself. We still need to stop by Mason Street. No. The answer came from Linda and Richard at the same time. Annie looked between them, offended by the alliance. I need clothes, she said. Mama needs her robe, her Bible, the framed picture. We can't just leave everything. Richard softened his tone. I had a cleaning and inspection team go in this morning after you gave permission. They packed only what you listed. Nothing else was touched. The photograph is safe. Annie's fingers tightened on the discharge folder. People went through our apartment? You gave Margaret the list yesterday. I know what I gave her. I didn't think it would feel like strangers touching our life. Linda reached for her hand. Baby, I don't want you breathing that air again today. Annie looked away. That was the sentence she could not fight. The car ride to the temporary apartment took less than 15 minutes, but Annie watched every street as if she needed to memorize the route in case she had to walk back. The building stood near the hospital. Not fancy in the way Richard's world was fancy, but clean, quiet, and warm. A doorman opened the lobby door without staring at Linda's oxygen equipment or Annie's worn coat. That alone made Annie uneasy. She was used to being noticed for the wrong reasons. The elevator took them to the 4th floor. Richard handed Annie a key card before opening the apartment. This is yours while you decide what comes next, he said. No one enters without your permission. My name is not on the door. Annie looked at the key card in her palm. Whose name is? The trust. She gave him a look. That sounds like your name with extra steps. Linda coughed once, then covered a smile. Annie. Richard did not take offense. The legal aid attorney can explain it better than I can. The apartment door opened to a small living room with plain furniture. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and windows that let in clean afternoon light. The heat worked without rattling. The walls had no damp stains. On the kitchen counter sat the bags from Mason Street, labeled in Margaret's neat handwriting. Linda clothes, Annie clothes, medicine, documents, kitchen items, photographs. Annie walked to the counter and opened the photograph bag first. She pulled out the framed picture of Samuel beside Richard's younger self. The glass was wrapped in a towel. She checked it, then exhaled for the first time since leaving the hospital. Linda sat on the couch, looking around with an expression Annie could not read. What is it? Annie asked. Linda touched the cushion beneath her palm. It doesn't smell like wet walls. Annie's face changed. She looked away quickly and busied herself with unpacking medication, but Richard saw the way her shoulders bent for a moment. In the old apartment, Annie had fought dust, leaks, and cold air as if hard work could turn neglect into safety. Here, the simple absence of dampness felt like a luxury she did not know how to accept. Richard stepped toward the kitchen. There are groceries, basic things, soup, bread, eggs, fruit, tea. If something is missing, Margaret can. No, Annie said quickly. This is enough. Linda looked at the grocery bag. There are oranges. Yes, Richard said. Sam used to buy oranges when he got paid, Linda said quietly. Said the house needed something bright. Annie stopped unpacking. Her fingers rested on the medicine bottles. Richard looked at the framed photograph now set on the counter. I didn't know that. There's a lot you didn't know, Linda said, not cruelly. I am learning. Annie opened the refrigerator and started arranging items, because arranging was easier than feeling. Dr. Porter said Mama needs the steroid after food. The antibiotic twice a day. Inhaler every 4 hours if needed, but not too much. And we have to watch for fever. Linda leaned back against the couch. She has become the nurse already. I'm not a nurse. Not yet, Linda said. Richard placed a folder on the kitchen table. Annie saw it and narrowed her eyes. What's that? Inspection report from Mason Street. You don't need to read it now. Then why bring it? Because it is yours. She wiped her hands on a towel and opened it anyway. The report was short but blunt. Water intrusion around window frames. Suspected mold behind the north wall. Unreliable heat. Poor ventilation. Medical risk for respiratory illness. Unsafe for Linda Johnson's recovery. Annie read it once, then again. So it wasn't just me not cleaning enough. Linda's head turned. Annie, I thought if I scrubbed more, if I kept the windows taped, if I boiled water when it got too dry. Her voice stopped. She pressed her lips together, angry at herself for saying too much. Richard stayed quiet. Linda reached out. Come here. Annie did not move at first. Then she crossed the room and knelt beside the couch, and Linda placed a thin hand on her cheek. You kept me alive in a room that was hurting me, Linda said. Don't you dare call that failure. Annie closed her eyes. I should have gotten the medicine earlier. You got it when you had $10 and needed 15. Annie gave a small, broken breath. I hated asking him. I know. Richard looked down, accepting the weight of that. Annie opened her eyes and stood. She pulled the folded pharmacy receipt from the back of her notebook, then reached into her coat pocket and took out a $5 bill. It was worn, creased from being held too tightly. Richard looked at it. Annie. No, she said. This part matters. Linda watched from the couch but did not stop her. Annie walked to him and held out the money. I got paid for the shift Denise covered for me. She said I could make up the hours next week. But she still gave me what I was owed from last Friday. So I'm paying you back. Richard accepted the bill because refusing would have insulted her more than taking it. Thank you. Annie also handed him the receipt. No, you keep this too. The receipt is yours. It was proof when you didn't believe me. Now it can be proof that I kept my word. Richard looked at the small paper, then at the $5 bill. He wanted to say she never needed to prove anything, but that would only make him feel better. So he nodded. I will keep it. Annie's face eased, not into happiness, but into something steadier. A debt had been closed, even if the larger ones remained. A knock came at the door. Richard opened it to a woman in her 40s with a canvas tote and reading glasses perched on her head. Marisol Grant, she said, legal aid. I was told Mrs. Johnson and Annie might have questions before signing anything, and that Mr. Whitmore is not allowed to hover. Annie looked at Richard. Richard lifted both hands slightly. Her words. Marisol stepped inside and smiled at Linda. I don't work for him. I don't work for his company. I'm here to make sure nobody rushes you. Linda looked relieved in spite of herself. Then you can sit. Richard moved toward the door. I'll wait downstairs. Annie turned. You don't have to. He paused. She looked at the apartment, the groceries, the photograph, the folder on the table, and then at her mother breathing without fighting the room. I mean, you don't have to disappear. Just give us a minute. Richard understood the difference. I'll be in the lobby. After he left, Marisol spread the papers on the table and began explaining everything in plain language. No pressure, no hidden fees, no claim on their choices. Temporary housing through the trust, medical bills handled separately, a full review of Samuel's benefits pending. Annie listened hard, asked questions, wrote answers in her notebook. Linda asked fewer questions, but the ones she asked cut straight to the point. When the meeting ended, evening had settled against the windows. Marisol packed her bag and said, You both are allowed to sleep tonight. That is not a legal opinion, just common sense. After she left, Annie made tea in the clean kitchen while Linda rested on the couch. The kettle worked. The cups matched. The heat stayed steady. It felt strange, almost suspicious, that a room could ask nothing from them. Linda watched her daughter move around the kitchen. You should call the community center tomorrow. Annie poured hot water into the cups. You just got out of the hospital. And I will still be out of the hospital while you make one phone call. Annie brought her tea. You're bossy when you can breathe. I was bossy before. You were just too scared to notice. Annie smiled then, small but real. Downstairs, Richard sat in the lobby with Samuel's $5 bill and the pharmacy receipt in his coat pocket. He had held checks worth millions without feeling their weight, yet that creased bill felt heavier than anything he had signed all week. When Annie finally came down, she found him near the window. Mama's resting, she said. Good. Marisol said the paperwork is fair. I'm glad. Annie stood beside him, looking out at the street. I'm calling the community center tomorrow. Richard turned toward her, but he kept his reaction measured. Good. I'm not promising I'll get the job. I did not expect you to, but I'll try. That is all anyone can ask. Annie looked at him for a long moment. My father trusted you once. Mama remembers that. I'm not there yet. I understand. But today helped. Richard nodded. He did not ask for more. Above them, Linda slept in clean air for the first time in years. On the kitchen counter, Samuel's photograph stood beside Annie's notebook. The old life and the possible one sharing the same light. The next morning, Annie woke before the alarm because she still did not trust quiet. For a few seconds, she lay still on the narrow bed in the temporary apartment, listening for Linda's breathing through the half-open bedroom door. No wheezing, no hard pull of air, no scrape of the old heater fighting the wall, just steady breath, soft traffic below the window, and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. It should have comforted her. Instead, it made her sit up too fast. She crossed the hall and looked in. Linda was asleep with one hand resting near the inhaler on the bedside table. The blanket was pulled neatly to her chest. Her face looked tired, but not frightened. Annie stood there for almost a full minute before letting herself breathe normally. "You're hovering," Linda murmured without opening her eyes. Annie startled. "I thought you were asleep." "I was until your worry walked in. I was checking." "You checked 3 times before sunrise." Annie leaned against the doorframe. "You counted?" "I'm a mother. Counting is part of the job." Annie smiled despite herself. "Do you need anything?" "Yes. For you to make that phone call." The smile faded. "It's early." "It's after 8. Community centers don't open right at 8. "Then call at 9. Annie looked toward the kitchen table, where her notebook sat beside Samuel's photograph. "You really want me to do this today?" Linda opened her eyes. "I want you to stop waiting for life to become easy before you start living it." Annie did not answer. That sounded like something her father would have said. Only Linda made it sharper. At 9 o'clock, Annie sat at the kitchen table with the phone in front of her, her notebook open to a blank page. She had written the name Richard gave her, South Lake Community Health Support Center. Under it, she had written 3 possible sentences, then crossed out 2 of them. Linda sat on the couch with tea. "Just call, baby. I know how to call. You've been staring at the number for 10 minutes. I'm preparing." "You're hiding in preparation." Annie looked at her. "You're very honest after hospitalization." "I wasted enough breath pretending." Annie picked up the phone before she could lose nerve and dialed. A woman answered on the 3rd ring. "South Lake Community Health Support Center. This is Denise Harper." Annie straightened. "Good morning. My name is Annie Johnson. I was told there might be an opening for an intake assistant. I wanted to ask if I could apply." There was a pause, not long, but long enough for Annie's grip to tighten. "Annie Johnson," Denise said. "Mr. Whitmore mentioned you might call." Annie's stomach dropped. "He did? He said you were interested." That was all. Annie glanced at Linda, who lifted her eyebrows as if to say, "Keep going." "I don't want special treatment," Annie said quickly. "I don't have office experience. And I don't want anyone to think I'm being sent in because he knows me." Denise did not sound offended. If anything, she sounded amused. "Good. I don't hire people because Richard Whitmore knows them. I barely let him make suggestions." Annie blinked. "Oh, what experience do you have?" Annie looked at her notebook. The clean page suddenly felt too clean. "I worked breakfast shifts at a diner. I cleaned tables, helped customers, handled rush hours. I take care of my mother's medical appointments and medication schedule. I'm good with forms if someone explains them once. I'm not afraid of people who are upset. I know how it feels when they are." The line was quiet for a second. Then Denise said, "That last part matters here." Annie lowered her eyes. "Yes, ma'am. Can you come in today at 1? Annie looked toward Linda. Linda nodded so hard Annie nearly laughed. "Yes," Annie said. "I can. Bring ID, any work references, and yourself. Don't bring fear, if you can leave some of it at home." Annie was not sure how to answer. "I'll try. That's enough for today." After the call ended, Annie set the phone down carefully, as if it might change its mind. Linda smiled. 1 o'clock. It's just an interview. That is more than yesterday. Annie looked toward the bedroom. "Can I leave you? I have medicine, tea, a phone, Dr. Porter's number, Richard's number, and a daughter who labeled everything in this apartment like a hospital supply room." I will survive 2 hours. It might be longer. Then I will survive 3. At noon, Annie stood in front of the bathroom mirror in her cleanest blouse. It had been packed from Mason Street and pressed under folded jeans, but the collar still curled slightly. She wet her fingers and tried to flatten it. Linda called from the living room. "Stop fighting the shirt. It has surrendered." Annie stepped out. "Does it look bad?" "It looks like you care." "That can look desperate." "No, it looks like you respect the chance." Annie put Samuel's small photograph in her notebook, then paused. "Do you think Daddy would want me to go?" Linda's face softened. "Your father would have driven you there 30 minutes early and waited outside pretending he wasn't nervous." Annie looked down, and this time she let the feeling come without swallowing it whole. "I wish he could." "I know." Richard's driver arrived at 12:30 because Richard had offered the car, and Annie had refused twice before accepting only after Linda reminded her that breathing clean air did not make buses run faster. The South Lake Community Health Support Center sat on a corner beside a small church and a grocery store. It was not impressive from the outside. Tan brick, wide windows, a ramp near the entrance, a sign with blue letters slightly faded by weather. But people were already moving in and out, some with envelopes, some with pill bottles, some with the tired expression Annie recognized too well. She stepped inside and immediately saw a woman at the front desk trying to balance a baby carrier with one hand and a folder of papers with the other. The woman looked close to tears. "I told them I don't understand this," the woman said to the receptionist. "The clinic gave me 3 forms and nobody said which one goes where." The receptionist was answering a phone and pointing toward a waiting area at the same time. Annie stood near the entrance for half a second, then moved before she thought better of it. "Excuse me," Annie said gently. "Do you want me to hold the folder while you adjust the carrier?" The woman looked at her, suspicious from exhaustion, then handed over the papers. "I'm sorry. I just can't do all of it." "You don't have to apologize." Annie glanced at the forms. "This one is for medication assistance. This one is income verification. This one looks like intake. They probably need that first." "How do you know?" "I've been around forms." The woman gave a weak laugh. "Lucky you." "Not lucky," Annie said, then softened it. "Just practiced." A voice behind her said, "Annie Johnson?" Annie turned. A woman in her late 40s stood near the hallway with a clipboard in her hand. She had warm eyes and the direct look of someone who noticed everything. "I'm Denise Harper." Annie quickly handed the folder back to the woman. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "To help someone in my lobby?" Denise asked. "That's a strange apology." The receptionist finally got off the phone and took the intake form from the woman. Denise watched Annie for another second, then nodded toward the hallway. "Come on back." The interview room was small, with 2 chairs, a desk, and a poster about patient rights on the wall. Annie sat with her notebook on her lap, and both feet flat on the floor. Denise looked over her application. "You graduated high school?" "Yes." "College?" "No, Mao." "Any training in medical billing?" "No." "Computer systems?" "Basic, I can learn." "Languages?" "English. Some Spanish from the diner, but not enough to claim it on paper." Denise looked up. "Honest answer. I don't want someone needing help and me pretending I understand them." Denise wrote something down. "Why do you want this job?" Annie had prepared an answer. It involved opportunity, responsibility, and wanting stable work. It sounded respectable. It also sounded like someone else. She looked at the patient rights poster, then back at Denise. "Last night I had to ask a stranger for $5 to buy my mother's medicine. Before he gave it to me, I had to prove I wasn't lying. I don't want people who come here to feel like they have to prove they're worth helping before anyone explains the next step." Denise's pen stopped. Annie's face warmed. "That was too much, wasn't it?" "No," Denise said. "That was the answer." Annie let out the breath she had been holding. Denise leaned back. "This work is not soft. People come in scared, angry, embarrassed, sick, tired, sometimes all at once. They miss appointments. They lose papers. They snap at the wrong person. We help them anyway, but we also keep records right. Compassion without accuracy can hurt people." Annie nodded. "I understand. Do you?" "My mother's support was lost in an office after my father died. Maybe nobody meant harm, but a wrong address, a missed call, a file closed too early. Those things became years for us. Denise looked at her for a long moment. Richard told me nothing about that. I know. I'm telling you because I don't want to be careless with someone else's paper. Denise closed the folder. The position is entry level. Pay is modest. Training starts Monday if you accept. 30 hours a week to begin, with room to grow. You will not be hired because of Richard Whitmore. You will be hired because I think you know the weight of the front desk. Annie stared at her. Are you offering me the job? I am. Annie's hands tightened around the notebook. I don't know what to say. Say you'll show up on time. I'll show up early. Denise smiled. That works too. When Annie left the center, the afternoon air felt different. Not easier. Exactly. The world had not become gentle. Linda was still sick. The old apartment was still unsafe. Samuel was still gone. But Annie had walked into a building with no money to offer and came out with work she had earned. She called Linda from the sidewalk. Well? Linda asked before Annie could speak. I got it. Linda made a sound that was half laugh, half prayer. I knew it. You did not know it. I knew enough. Annie looked back at the center windows. A man in a work uniform was helping the same woman from earlier carry papers to the desk. Mama? Yes? I think I can do this. Linda's voice softened. Baby. You already started. That evening, Richard received one message from Annie. No long explanation. No gratitude too heavy to carry. I got the job. Training starts Monday. He read it twice, then placed Samuel's $5 bill and the pharmacy receipt in the top drawer of his desk. For the first time, they did not feel like evidence of failure alone. They felt like the beginning of repair. Annie started training at South Lake Community Health Support Center on Monday morning. 20 minutes early with her notebook, 2 pens, and the small photograph of Samuel tucked into the back pocket of her folder. Denise Harper found her sitting in the lobby before the lights in the front office had fully warmed. You know the doors don't officially open until 8:30, Denise said. Annie stood too fast. I didn't want to be late. There's early, and then there's arriving before the copier has forgiven the weekend. Annie looked toward the machine in the corner. Does it usually hold grudges? Every Monday. Denise smiled and waved her toward the desk. Come on. If you're going to be early, you can learn where we keep the forms everyone loses. The first hour was not dramatic. Denise showed her the intake system, the appointment calendar, the supply cabinet, the drawer with bus passes, and the folder marked urgent but not emergency. Annie wrote everything down, not because she thought she would forget, but because writing made the room feel less overwhelming. People began arriving after 9. A man needed help rescheduling a clinic visit because his work shift had changed. A woman brought a letter she did not understand from Medicaid. An older couple came in with 3 bottles of medication and no idea which one had been replaced by the new prescription. Annie watched Denise handle each person with calm speed. You don't fix their whole life at the desk, Denise told her between visitors. You find the next step that keeps them from walking out worse than they came in. Annie nodded. That sounds simple. It isn't. I didn't think it was. Around 11, the front door opened and a woman stepped in with a pharmacy bag in one hand and a crumpled receipt in the other. Her coat was buttoned wrong, and her eyes moved across the lobby like she expected someone to tell her she had come to the wrong place. The receptionist was on the phone. Denise was in the back with a caseworker. Annie looked at the woman, then at the empty chair in front of the desk. Good morning, Annie said. You can sit here if you want. The woman approached slowly. I was told somebody here helps with medication forms. We do. What's your name? Carla. Hi, Carla. I'm Annie. She glanced at the pharmacy bag but did not reach for it. Do you want to tell me what happened? Carla let out a breath. They said the price changed. It was supposed to be 12, now it's 38. I paid it because my husband needs it, but that was grocery money. The pharmacy said maybe there's a discount card, but I don't know how to do all that. Annie felt the memory before she could stop it. Hard white lights. $10 on a counter. Richard's guarded eyes. She kept her face steady. That's a lot to have dropped on you without warning, Annie said. Carla looked at her, surprised by the plainness of the sentence. Yes, it is. We can check the medication assistance list. I'm still training, so I'm going to ask Denise to make sure I do it right, but you won't have to figure it out alone. Carla's shoulders lowered a little. Thank you. I hate asking. I know, Annie said, then corrected herself. I mean, I understand. Denise returned halfway through the conversation and listened from near the hallway without interrupting. Annie opened the assistance binder, found the medication category, and asked Carla for the prescription name and pharmacy location. Her hands were steady, but inside she was counting every step. Do not make her repeat herself. Do not make her feel accused. Do not act like the paper matters more than the person holding it. When Carla left with a printed discount option, a callback appointment, and a grocery voucher from the emergency drawer, she paused at the door. You're new? Carla asked. Yes. You don't sound new. After she left, Annie looked at Denise. Did I make a mistake? Denise leaned against the desk. A few. You clicked into the wrong screen twice, forgot to mark the pharmacy follow-up, and almost gave her the carbon copy instead of the original. Annie's face fell. Oh, but you did the important part right. You let her keep her dignity while she asked for help. The computer part will come. Annie breathed out. I can fix the follow-up. I know. That's why I didn't fix it for you. By the end of the day, Annie's feet hurt. Her head was full, and her notebook had 6 pages of instructions. She stayed 10 extra minutes to straighten the front desk forms. Denise watched her from the doorway. You don't have to prove you deserve the job on the first day, Denise said. Annie kept aligning the papers. I know. Do you? Annie stopped, then looked at her. Not yet. Denise's expression softened. But she did not pity her. Annie appreciated that. Go home, Denise said. Come back tomorrow. That's how work becomes yours. One day at a time. Annie took the bus back because she wanted to. Richard had offered a ride through Margaret that morning, and Annie had answered politely that she needed to learn the route herself. The ride took longer than a car, but it gave her time to sit with the day. Outside the window, Chicago moved in late afternoon layers. Brick storefronts, school buses, people carrying groceries, a man sweeping the sidewalk in front of a barber shop. None of it looked different, yet Annie felt as if she had crossed a line no one else could see. At the apartment, Linda was sitting at the kitchen table with her pill organizer open and a cup of tea beside her. The oxygen equipment Dr. Porter had ordered stood near the wall. Unused for the moment, but ready. The room was warm. The air did not fight them. How was it? Linda asked. Annie set her bag down. I made mistakes. Linda nodded seriously. Good. That means they let you do something. Annie pulled out a chair and sat. A woman came in because her husband's medicine cost more than she expected. She was embarrassed. I helped her fill out the assistance forms. Linda studied her face. And I didn't make her feel small. Linda reached across the table and covered Annie's hand. Then your first day was a success. Annie looked toward Samuel's photograph on the counter. I kept thinking about the pharmacy. I figured you would. I hated that night. I know, but maybe because it happened, I knew what not to do to her. Linda's hand tightened around hers. Pain should not have to become training. But sometimes God doesn't waste what people survive. Annie sat with that for a moment. She was not ready to call the night a gift. It had been too frightening, too humiliating. But perhaps not everything that hurt had to remain only hurt. A knock came at the door around 7. Annie opened it to find Richard standing in the hallway with a small envelope in his hand. I hope this is not a bad time, he said. Linda called from the table. If you brought paperwork, it is always a bad time. Richard looked toward her. Then I will start with good news. Annie stepped aside. Come in. He entered but stayed near the kitchen, as if he had learned not to take space without being invited to it. He handed the envelope to Linda. What is this? She asked. The first official disbursement from Samuel's approved family support. Marisol reviewed it before I brought it. It covers the amount that should have been released after his death, plus interest. More will follow after the full audit. Linda did not open it. She placed both hands on top of the envelope and looked down at it as if it might break something. Annie's voice was careful. Mama? Linda swallowed. For years, I thought if I had made one more call, asked the right person, kept the old address longer, maybe things would have been different. Richard said, You should not have had to chase a promise. Linda looked up at him. No, I shouldn't have. The answer was firm, and something in Richard's face changed. Maybe relief. Maybe respect. She had not softened the truth for him. Annie took the chair beside her mother. "Do you want me to open it?" "Not yet," Linda said. "Let it sit there a minute." Richard nodded. "There is something else." Annie glanced at him. "More paperwork?" "No." He reached into his coat and took out the $5 bill Annie had repaid and the pharmacy receipt, now placed carefully in a clear protective sleeve. "I would like your permission to frame these with Samuel's photograph in my office." Annie stared at them. "Why?" "So I do not forget what $5 revealed." Linda looked at the bill, then at Richard. "That sounds like something people put on a wall to make themselves feel noble." "It could become that," Richard said. "That is why I am asking." Annie appreciated the honesty. She looked at the bill, then at the receipt with Linda's medication listed in small print. That paper had once been proof she was not lying. Then it became proof she kept her word. Now Richard wanted it to become proof that a company could not measure need by convenience. "What would you put under it?" Annie asked. Richard took a folded card from his pocket and handed it to her. On it, in simple black print, were the words, "Never measure a person's pain by the amount they lack." Annie read the sentence twice. Linda read it over her shoulder. "That sounds like Sam," Linda said quietly. Richard looked at the photograph on the counter. "It sounds like what he tried to teach me." Annie handed the card back. "You can frame it." Richard's eyes moved to her. "Are you sure?" "Yes, but not just in your office where rich people admire it." He waited. "Put it somewhere your employees see it too," Annie said. "The ones who close files, the ones who answer phones, the ones who decide whether someone gets called back." Richard nodded slowly. "You are right." Linda gave a small smile. "She usually is. It gets annoying." Annie rolled her eyes, but this time she smiled too. When Richard left later, the envelope still sat unopened on the table, but it no longer felt like charity dressed as paperwork. It felt like something Samuel had earned finally arriving at the right door. Annie washed the teacups while Linda rested, and before turning off the kitchen light, she looked at her father's photograph. "I got through the first day," she whispered. The man in the picture did not answer, of course, but in the clean, warm apartment, with her mother breathing steadily in the next room and tomorrow waiting without quite as much fear, Annie felt as if he already knew. The next morning, Richard had the framed piece placed outside the employee relations department instead of inside his private office. Margaret handled the arrangement herself. Samuel's photograph sat on the left, the $5 bill and pharmacy receipt on the right, and beneath them was the sentence Annie had approved. "Never measure a person's pain by the amount they lack." By 9 o'clock, people had started slowing down as they passed it. Some read quickly and kept walking. Others stopped. A young assistant from legal stood there for almost a minute, then wiped her eyes before pretending to check her phone. 2 men from finance looked at the receipt, then at each other, saying nothing. A woman from payroll whispered, "Who was Samuel Johnson?" And someone behind her answered, "A driver." Margaret heard it and turned. "He was not just a driver." The woman looked embarrassed. "I didn't mean—" "I know," Margaret said more gently. "That is the point." Richard arrived a few minutes before the board meeting. He stopped in front of the frame and saw his reflection faintly in the glass. Behind his own face was Samuel's, steady as ever, and beside it, a receipt for medicine Annie had needed to prove her mother's illness was real. Richard stood there long enough for Margaret to come beside him. "The board is waiting," she said. "They can wait another minute." She followed his eyes to the receipt. Several employees asked what it means. "What did you tell them?" "That they should attend the meeting." Richard nodded. "Good." The boardroom on the top floor had a long table, a wide view of Chicago, and men and women who had come prepared to discuss risk, cost, optics, and shareholder reaction. Charles Benton sat near the far end, present only because his counsel had advised him not to appear absent. His expression was controlled, but the tightness around his mouth gave him away. Richard entered with Margaret behind him, carrying no slides, no prepared packet, no public relations language. He placed Samuel's file at the head of the table and remained standing. "I am suspending the standard agenda," he said. One board member, Alan Pierce, frowned. "Richard, we have quarterly items to approve." "They will wait." Alan glanced around. "This is about the employee support audit?" "Yes." Charles exhaled audibly. "Then we should speak with precision." Richard looked at him. "We will." Margaret turned on the screen. Instead of a chart, Samuel's employment photograph appeared first. His name was below it. Samuel Johnson, executive driver, 7 years of service, injured during a security incident while protecting the chairman. Approved family support not delivered. The room quieted. Richard did not sit. This man saved my life. Years later, his daughter stood in a pharmacy with $10, trying to buy $15 worth of medicine for her mother. She asked me for $5. I doubted her. My company had already failed her family once. That night, I nearly failed her again. No one moved. The sentence had not been shaped to flatter him. And because of that, the board listened. A woman named Helen Cross leaned forward. Richard, are you saying the company had an active obligation to the Johnson family? I am saying we made one. We approved support and did not deliver it. Leonard Briggs from legal adjusted his glasses. The formal question is whether the failure creates liability. Richard turned toward him. The formal question is whether we are going to hide behind that word while people wait for help they were promised. Alan's jaw tightened. We have to consider consequences. If we reopen every old case, we may invite claims beyond what we can verify. Margaret stepped in then. We have verified enough to begin. 28 dormant cases. 9 approved but not fully delivered. 12 requiring urgent review. The policy that allowed closure after 1 year was applied inconsistently and often without meaningful contact attempts. Helen looked at Charles. You oversaw that policy? Charles sat straighter. I recommended a cost containment framework. At the time, unresolved files were creating administrative burden and potential exposure. Richard let the words hang for a moment. Administrative burden, potential exposure. Those are clean phrases for leaving families to carry what we promised to carry. Charles's face reddened. You keep framing this as cruelty. It was not cruelty. It was governance. Governance without conscience becomes cruelty with better stationery. The boardroom went still. Alan leaned back and folded his arms. What are you proposing? Richard nodded to Margaret. A new document appeared on the screen. Samuel Johnson, Employee Promise Initiative. We will reopen every dormant support file from the past 20 years. We will use outside investigators and independent counsel to locate families. Approved but unpaid support will be honored with interest. Medical care promised after injury or service will be paid through a dedicated fund. Employee relations will no longer be allowed to close a support case without documented live contact attempts and independent review. Helen read the screen. Estimated cost? Margaret answered. Initial reserve, $12 million. Could increase after full review. Alan's eyes sharpened. $12 million to correct files most people have forgotten? Richard looked at him. The families did not forget. Charles leaned forward. This will be seen as an admission. It should be, Richard said. Leonard looked uneasy. That language could be damaging. So was silence. Alan tapped his pen. Shareholders will ask why now. Richard placed the pharmacy receipt on the table. It had been copied for the frame, but he held the original in a protective sleeve. Because a young woman had to prove her mother needed medicine before I believed she needed $5. Because her father once protected the life of the man sitting in this chair. Because if power cannot go back and repair what it broke, then power is only decoration. Helen was the first to lower her eyes. I support the initiative. Alan looked at her. Helen, I support it, she repeated. And I think if we fight this on cost alone, we deserve whatever shame follows. One by one, the others shifted. Not all from conviction. Some from pressure. Some because Richard had made the alternative too ugly to defend in public. But that did not matter to him yet. The vote passed. Charles remained seated after the others began gathering their papers. Richard looked down the table at him. Your suspension becomes termination pending final legal review, Richard said. Charles stood slowly. After all these years? Those years are exactly the problem. I protected you. No, Richard said. Samuel protected me. You protected convenience. Charles gathered his folder. But before leaving, he looked back. You think this girl has made you noble? Richard's face did not change. No. She made me ashamed. Nobility would have required seeing it sooner. Charles left. and the door closed behind him with a soft click. By noon, an internal memo went to every Whitmore Holdings employee. It did not mention Annie's name. Richard had promised her privacy, and he kept it. The memo named Samuel Johnson, acknowledged failed support, announced the reopening of dormant cases, and ended with one line: "We will no longer call a promise complete until it reaches the person it was made to protect." At South Lake, Annie read the memo during her lunch break because Denise brought it to her printed on 2 pages. "I thought you should see it before someone else mentions it," Denise said. Annie took the paper with careful hands. She read her father's name, then read it again. Samuel Johnson. Not a rumor. Not a file buried in a tower. Not only a photograph on a kitchen counter. His name was now tied to a promise that might reach other people before it was too late. Denise sat across from her. "You all right?" Annie nodded, though her throat had tightened. "He didn't use my name. He said he wouldn't. People keep promises sometimes," Annie said quietly, as if testing whether the sentence could be trusted. Denise folded her hands. "Yes, some do." That afternoon, Annie helped a man complete a transportation assistance form and walked an elderly woman through a medication refill request. Twice, she saw people stop near the front desk because they did not know how to ask without sounding desperate. Each time, she stood before shame could settle over them. "Start with what you need," she told one man. "We'll figure out the paper after that." When her shift ended, she went home with the printed memo folded in her notebook. Linda was sitting by the window, a blanket over her knees and tea on the table. Annie placed the memo in front of her. Linda put on her reading glasses and moved slowly through each line. When she reached Samuel's name, her hand stopped. She did not cry. She only touched the paper once, right where his name appeared. "They spelled it right," Linda said. Annie looked at her, confused for a second, then understood. For years, official letters had misspelled names, shortened lives, turned grief into forms. Here, Samuel Johnson stood whole. "Yes," Annie said, "they spelled it right." Linda leaned back and closed her eyes. Sam would have said not to make a fuss. Annie sat beside her. And then he would have helped every family on that list. Linda smiled faintly. Yes, he would have. Across town, Richard stood outside employee relations again as workers passed the framed display. This time, he did not see it as a tribute. He saw it as a warning. $5 had opened the door, but justice would have to walk through it every day. In offices, on phones, in files, in the way one tired person spoke to another. He looked at Samuel's photograph and said quietly, "We started. It was not enough, but it was no longer nothing." By the time Richard came to dinner at the apartment, Linda had been home from the hospital long enough to argue about salt, fold her own sweater, and complain that Annie watched her like a security guard. That, Annie decided, meant recovery had truly begun. The temporary apartment no longer felt quite as temporary. There were oranges in a bowl on the counter because Linda had asked for them, medicine schedules taped inside the kitchen cabinet, and Samuel's photograph standing near the window where the afternoon light touched it first. Annie opened the door before Richard knocked a second time. He stood in the hallway with a paper bag in one hand and a look of uncertainty she had never seen on him before. "You're early," she said. "Your father would have approved." Annie stepped aside. "That depends. Did you bring more paperwork?" "No, cornbread," Linda called from the kitchen. "Then he can come in." Richard entered and handed the bag to Annie. The apartment smelled of roasted chicken, green beans, mashed potatoes, and tea. Linda stood near the counter in a blue sweater, moving more slowly than she used to, but upright. Annie had tried to make her sit 3 times and failed 3 times. Richard looked at her with relief he did not try to hide. "You look better." "I breathe better," Linda said. "Looking better is extra." Annie put the cornbread on the table. "Mama made the chicken." Linda pointed a spoon at her. "Annie seasoned it. I supervised. You sat in a chair and told me I used too much pepper." "That is supervision." Richard removed his coat and looked around the room. The framed photograph of Samuel was near the window, but beside it now sat a second small frame. Inside was a copy of the internal memo from Whitmore Holdings, folded so Samuel's name showed clearly. Richard noticed and stopped. Linda followed his gaze. Annie printed it. Annie busied herself with plates. "I thought Mama should have it." Linda touched the frame lightly. They spelled his name right. Richard nodded. They will keep spelling it right. Dinner began awkwardly because gratitude and guilt had both been invited without anyone saying so. Richard sat where Linda told him to sit, across from Annie and beside the window. The food was simple and warm. For several minutes, they talked about safe things, medication times, Annie's second week at South Lake, Dr. Porter's follow-up visit, and how the building's heat worked so well that Linda had started opening a window for a few minutes in the afternoon just to feel fresh air move. "You're not supposed to stand by cold windows," Annie said. Linda looked at Richard. "Do you see what I live with?" Richard took a sip of tea. "A very strict intake assistant, training assistant," Annie corrected. "Denise said you handled 3 walk-ins without help yesterday." Annie gave him a look. "Denise talks too much. She said you corrected a form that would have delayed someone's medication. That was basic." Linda smiled at Richard. "When she says basic, she means she is proud, but refuses to admit it." Annie reached for the green beans. "Can we eat without turning me into a meeting topic?" Richard almost smiled. "Of course, but after a while." Annie brought it back herself. "There was a man yesterday," she said. "He kept apologizing because he couldn't read the insurance letter. He said he should have known better. I told him letters are written badly on purpose sometimes." Linda raised an eyebrow. "Sometimes? Most times," Annie said. He laughed a little. "Then he let me help him." Richard listened carefully. "You made him feel safe. I made him feel like he wasn't stupid. That is not a small thing." Annie looked down at her plate. Compliments still sat uncomfortably on her. "I just remembered what it felt like in the pharmacy." The table went quiet, but not painfully. The memory had changed. It no longer belonged only to humiliation. It had become part of the path that brought them here, to a table where Linda could eat without gasping, where Annie had a job that used the hurt instead of burying it, where Richard sat with his sleeves slightly rolled back like a guest instead of a man used to being served. Linda set her fork down. "I hated that you had to ask him." "I know, but I don't hate what came after." Annie looked at her mother. Linda's voice stayed calm. "I hate the fear. I hate the years we waited. I hate that your father's name had to be found in a file instead of honored when it should have been. But I don't hate this table. I don't hate breathing. I don't hate seeing you come home tired from work that may become something bigger." Annie swallowed. "Mama, I'm allowed to say true things at my own table." Richard looked at Linda. "It is your table." Linda turned to him. "Then at my table, we use first names." Richard paused. Annie looked up, surprised. Linda pointed gently at him. "You have been Mr. Whitmore long enough. If you are going to eat my chicken and bring cornbread into my kitchen, you can be Richard." Something in his face shifted. Not dramatic. Not grand. Just a man receiving an invitation he knew he had not fully earned but would be foolish to refuse. "Thank you, Linda," he said. She nodded. "That's better." Annie leaned back slightly. "Does that mean I have to call him Richard too?" Linda glanced at her. "You can call him whatever your manners allow." Richard looked at Annie. "Mr. Whitmore is fine." Annie studied him, then said, "Richard is shorter." "It is. I'll think about it." Linda laughed softly, and this time it did not turn into a cough. After dinner, Annie cleared the plates despite Richard offering to help. Linda told her to let the man carry something, so Annie handed him the cornbread plate. He took it to the counter as if entrusted with something fragile. They washed and dried together in the kitchen while Linda sat at the table with tea. "You looked nervous when you came in," Annie said quietly. Richard dried a plate. "I was." "Why?" "I have attended state dinners, merger dinners, charity dinners, board dinners. None of them mattered like this." Annie glanced at him, unsure whether to accept the answer. He placed the plate in the rack. "I did not want to bring the wrong version of myself here." "What version did you bring?" "The one still learning." Annie looked at the sink. "That's probably the safest one." He nodded. "I agree." When the dishes were done, Linda asked Richard to bring the small box from his coat pocket because, as she put it, a man does not keep touching his jacket unless he brought something he is afraid to mention. Richard looked caught. Annie folded her arms. "She notices everything. I am learning that too," he said. He took a small wooden frame from his coat pocket and placed it on the table. Inside was a photograph of the display outside employee relations. Samuel's picture, the $5 bill, the receipt, and the sentence beneath. Never measure a person's pain by the amount they lack. I thought you should have a copy, Richard said. Not to replace anything, just so you know where it stands. Annie picked it up carefully. People see this every day? Yes. Do they know who gave you the sentence? They know it came from the family's approval. I did not use your name. Linda looked at the image for a long time. Sam would have hated being on a wall. He would, Richard said, but he would have understood why. Annie traced the edge of the frame. The receipt looked so small. It was small, Richard said. That was what made it unforgivable. Linda reached for the frame, and Annie handed it to her. $5, Linda said, almost to herself. That little amount opened a door people had kept shut for years. Annie sat beside her. It bought the medicine first. Yes, Linda said. That too. Richard looked at the two of them, mother and daughter shoulder to shoulder, Samuel's photograph behind them in the window light. For years, he had thought debt meant contracts, signatures, numbers owed. Now he understood that some debts waited in other forms: a driver's loyalty, a widow's unanswered call, a daughter's shame at a pharmacy counter, a promise that had to be carried back to the people it was made to protect. Linda set the frame beside Samuel's photograph. There, he can keep an eye on it. Annie smiled. Daddy would like that. Later, Richard stood to leave. Linda insisted he take a plate of leftovers, and when he tried to refuse, she looked at him in a way that ended the discussion. Annie walked him to the door with the covered plate in her hands. I'll give this to your driver, she said. He will appreciate it. She opened the door, then paused. Richard. He looked at her. It was the first time she had used his name without testing it first. Thank you, she said. Not for the $5. I paid that back. I remember. For coming back after you could have walked away. Richard held her gaze. Thank you for asking when you had every reason to stop trusting strangers. Annie looked down the hallway, then back at him. I still don't trust strangers easily. You shouldn't, but you're not exactly a stranger anymore. No, he said. I suppose not. She handed him the plate. Good night. Good night, Annie. When the door closed, Annie stood there for a second with her hand still on the knob. Behind her, Linda was humming softly in the kitchen, a habit that had disappeared for years and returned only in the last few days. The apartment was warm. The air was clean. On the counter, Samuel's photograph stood beside the framed copy of a lesson paid for in pain but no longer trapped there. Annie went to the window and looked down at the street. Richard stepped out of the building carrying leftovers like any dinner guest. His driver opened the car door. But Richard turned back and looked up. He could not see her clearly, but Annie lifted one hand anyway. Downstairs, Richard saw the movement in the window and raised his hand in return. Years earlier, Samuel Johnson had saved Richard Whitmore's life in a hallway filled with danger. Years later, Samuel's daughter had saved something quieter in him, something almost lost beneath wealth, caution, and polished excuses. She had asked for $5, but what she had really done was force a man to look at the distance between what he had promised and what he had allowed. $5 had bought one breath. One breath had uncovered an old debt, and an old debt, finally answered, had given 3 people a seat at the same table. The story reminds us that no act of kindness is ever too small when someone is fighting for something as basic as dignity, medicine, or one more breath. $5 meant almost nothing to Richard Whitmore, but to Annie and her mother, it became the difference between fear and hope. The lesson is simple. Never judge a person's pain by the amount they lack, and never assume someone asking for help is asking because they are weak. Sometimes, the person standing in front of us with trembling hands is carrying a story we cannot see, and the way we respond may either deepen their wound or open the door to healing. True justice is not loud revenge. It is quietly going back, keeping forgotten promises, and making sure the next person does not have to beg to be believed. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.